Hello everyone, it is Joe here from Omnipoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCGO codes, including the stuff from Evolving Skies, make sure you go ahead and check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your order using that code, Omnipoke. For today's video, myself and Jack are going to be talking all about the Fusion Strike expansion, giving you our set review, our thoughts on the best and most interesting cards from this set. Going to be released on the 12th of November, and it's 264 cards within the set. It is absolutely monstrous, so let's waste no time and get straight into it.
Yep, and as per usual, we have the Omnipoke rating system, so 1 to 5 stars. Feel free to pause if you want to familiarise yourself with that. We have community rating. We posted out the community poll a couple of weeks ago. Thank you for everyone who submitted. We had loads of submissions once again, and we will be giving away some codes to a couple of the people that were kind enough to dedicate their time. And also, you can see we have a new couple of sort of labels up here. We have Dust Craft Keep. Basically, it looks like PTCG Live is going to be having this sort of crafting and dusting system. So we're going to give you our quick thoughts on whether this is a card you can kind of get rid of, is very unlikely to see play, whether you should maybe hold on to it, and it's a keep card, but, you know, not urgent if you don't pull one straight away, or whether you should craft it because we're certain there's definitely going to be playability in the card. So yeah, this is going to add a little bit more depth to some of our reviews, and we think it's a really nice system. If you just want to quickly scroll through, and rather than watch the whole video, you can just kind of see our quick thoughts on what we should dust, keep, and craft. But yeah, without further ado, let's jump into the trainers, and we're kicking things off with Adventurous Discovery. This is a card that Japan got a little while ago, and we've kind of been waiting for it for a couple of months. It lets you search your deck for up to 3 Pokemon V, reveal them and put them into your hand. So it's kind of, we've seen a lot of these effects in the past, and often they have been pretty good. At the moment, we're in a format where things like Boss, Marnie, and Research are just dominating the game, honestly. So it's hard to kind of justify using something like this over one of those. In exactly some of these Fusion Strike decks, you would want that kind of effect, but they have their own sort of supporter that does that. So in those kind of decks, it's not great. We can kind of seeing play in decks where you want to get a lot of V Pokemon onto the board or VMAXs down, i.e. Shadow Rider to be able to draw more cards with Underworld Door, or Eternatus where you can fill your board quite wide, so you want to be grabbing, you know, Eternatus, Crobat, more basics to be able to get into those higher ends of Dread End. Unfortunately, both of those decks aren't particularly competitive right now, so more than anything, it's definitely a very viable card, and in the right deck it could be pretty strong. It's definitely worth keeping, as you can see in the top right-hand side. But at the moment, there's just not really the perfect deck for it, so we don't think it's going to push much further than a 2-star, just because the main decks it's going to be in sort of Calyrex and Eternatus, in our opinion, aren't the strongest right now.
Next up, we have Chili, CIlan, and Cress. And Jack just alluded to this in the previous slide, where Fusion Strike Pokemon now have this great option available to it to get multiple of them out the deck. It allows you to search your deck for 3 Fusion Pokemon, reveal them and put them into your hand, then shuffle your deck. And one of the better things about Chili, CIlan, and Cress is that it gets basics as well as evolution, so it doesn't necessarily fall off immediately. And what we love is the Fusion Strike deck, as you'll come to know throughout talking about it. We think it's one of the strongest decks from the set. Genesect wants to go wide on the board because then you gain more cards via its ability. So you really are trying to get multiple down early. You can use every single one of your Genesects in the same turn, as long as you can keep dumping your hand lower each time and refilling with Genesect. So very happy to use this. It gets you evolutions as well as like single prize basics and like your 2 prizes, so you can get your tech Pokemon like Latias if you're trying to copy it with Mew. You can get things like Toxels developed on the board early as well to reduce hit points with that evolution, the Toxtricity. So the reason why we're only giving that 3-star rating is the nature of the Fusion Strike deck wants to have quite a low count of supporter cards because they end up clogging up your hand. They're not insta-playable. You can only use 1 supporter per turn, obviously. And in this instance, you probably only want to use Chili, CIlan, and Cress in that early game stage to get early Genesects. Yes, you can use it in situations to get Toxtricities and Mews and that sort of thing. but it's a lot less powerful and it gets massive diminishing returns. So we think it's possible that it does go into the Fusion Strike deck, most likely as like a 2 count, not much higher than that. And if you want to increase your odds of seeing it in the early turns, you probably play Pokegear because it's an insta-play in every other situation. So it may outweigh things like Fog Crystal, Quick Ball, and Battle VIP Pass in terms of this engine, and you may lean in towards this supporter. But there's also a chance you go the full trainer route instead, and that is just more versatile in general because then Peony can be your engine. Well, it'll probably go alongside Chili and Cress anyway, but these would be supplementary supporters at the best of times. So it's not mandatory to be in the Fusion Strike deck, but it may end up coming out on top. So there is big potential here. Definitely a keep for us.
Next up, we have Dancer. Dancer is super simple. Draw 2 cards. If it's your first turn going second, draw 3 more. Kind of reminiscent to Lily, but only works on one side of the coin flip, which is awkward. You know, you can see the Duster Mark and you can see the community rating. This is a really low power supporter card, even in a world where things like research is just better anyway. Even if research wasn't here, it's still a supporter card that only gets more value than a draw 2 on one turn of the game 50% of the time. So you can already tell that that's just not worth playing in the deck.
Next up, we have another great Fusion Strike supporter. The Elesa's Sparkle is going to be the energy acceleration option that Fusion Strike decks are likely to play here. It allows you to choose up to 2 of your Fusion Strike Pokemon in play. For each of those, search your deck for a Fusion Energy and attach it to that Pokemon, then shuffle your deck. So a really great way that you can maintain these high energy attack costs, actually, especially with Genesect here. It means that you're not forced into just throwing 2 VMAXs at the opponent and give your opponent an easier prize trade. You can try and weave in Genesect if need be, maybe for some different type coverage, or if you're worried about, if your opponent's playing a dark deck, you can weave in the Genesect to be that attacker instead. Or you can just, evade things like Fan of Waves or Crushing Hammer and still have excess energies around, which is awesome. And Fusion Energy is just a great energy in itself. It then means that your Fusion Strike Pokemon can't be affected by abilities from your opponent's Pokemon. So it's a great way to protect yourself from, gusting from an Umbreon, from Inteleon pings, that sort of thing. So you love having Fusion Strike energy on your board a lot of the time. It makes your entire, Fusion Strike Pokemon that you're attaching to, usually your biggest threats, they are then protected. So Elesa's Sparkle gives you that little bit of protection to Hammer, that little bit of burst potential as well, the option to attack with 2 prizes and not just straight into the VMAXs. And we feel like this is going to very likely be a 2 of again with these Pokegears. We've mentioned it before, how we feel the Fusion Strike deck will be built because you don't want to lean into the Elesa Sparkle too much, because it does again get that sort of diminishing returns issue. Once you've used your first Elesa Sparkle, it's much less likely that you're going to get full value on that second one, or any value whatsoever. You may have drawn into your Fusion Strike or your Fusion Energy, or you've prized them, something like that. So it's like a one and done deal, but it's such a big power spike, such a great burst of acceleration that you want to lean into this, and it just makes you a much safer deck all around.
Next up, we have School Kids. There's 2 supporters, Schoolgirl and Schoolboy. Both of these are pretty shoddy, to be honest. They both say, well, Schoolgirl says draw 2 cards. If your opponent has 6, 4, or 2 prize cards remaining, draw 2 more. And the Schoolboy says draw 2 cards. If your opponent has 5, 3, or 1 prize cards remaining, draw 2 more. You can kind of dictate, based on the deck you're playing, you can kind of make this guaranteed to be drawing 4. But even just a raw draw 4 isn't going to be played right now. As we mentioned in every set review, Marnie and Research are just more premium draw supporters. So yeah, these really aren't anything worth writing home about, to be honest.
Next up, we have Sidney. Sidney is actually quite an interesting control style card. It forces your opponent to reveal their hand. Then you can discard up to 2 in any combination of Stadium, Special Energy, or tools that you find there. And we feel like this actually may end up having a home in controlling decks. We know that right now control isn't very high on the radar, but we do think there are some great cards from this set that could give it that little bit more viability, and we think Sidney could be that sort of one-of option here to help you win a Stadium War, potentially. As we know, Galamine is a big part of the win condition of Control, where you try and trap things with Boss's Orders and combine it with dropping a mine. So getting rid of Stadiums from the opponent is always great. There's so many Special Energy-reliant decks. The Fusion Strike deck will also play a ton of Special Energy, so just having discard those from hand is great, similar to how Team Skullgrunt would work, where we know there are so many archetypes reliant on almost entirely Special Energy right now. So this is kind of a live target quite a lot, which is great. and also hitting tools. Air Balloon is one of those ones you definitely want to try and get rid of as that control side as well. So there's a lot to like here, even getting rid of like tool jammers from decks as well, so that you have your own Air Balloons or other tool cards would be great. So Sidney seems to fit the role as like a one-of in control, most likely. It's not guaranteed to go in there because we know that it's a tight deck right now where you have to fit in multiple stage 1s and then have other tech Pokemon in and around at the moment. It's quite messy control right now, but Sidney could easily find its way as that one-of to really mostly get the Galamines to stick in play, we'd say.
Next up, we have Battle VIP Pass, a card we've already kind of spoken about a little bit. This is a really interesting one. This card can only be used on the first turn. Whether you're going first or second, it doesn't matter. You can use it on your first turn, but it can only be used on that turn 1. So search your deck for 2 basic Pokemon and put them onto your bench. Initially, I think a lot of people were very reticent to even try this card out because obviously it can only be used in 1 turn of the game. But in exactly Peony Engines, we've been trying it out as a 1 and sometimes 2-of, primarily a 1-of, but sometimes a 2-of. But as a 1-of, it's actually very, very strong. Going second in a Peony Engine, it turns out it can just grab 2 Genesects, and Genesects draw so many cards, it can kind of turn your Peony into a draw supporter whilst tutoring cards at the same time, which is really nice. So in these kind of engines, in exactly Peony on turn 1, it's better than a Quick Ball because it allows you to also get an extra card, whether that's an Energy Search, a Stadium to bounce a path to be able to draw with your Genesects, even just another Quick Ball to then be able to, once you've drawn with some Genesects, discard one of the sort of excess cards you have to draw more. So yeah, it's not groundbreaking. It's not going to be a 4 of anything. It doesn't feel like it's worth it because it just becomes, again, very cloggy in the hand, similarly to how we've said with some of these other cards. You're not going to play 4 infusion decks just to try and get more Genesects on the board because eventually they just become unplayable until you can find a way of discarding them, which isn't great. But being able to tutor them out on exactly turn 1 of the game does feel very, very strong. We don't think it's going to be staple, but I think it's definitely a card that me and Joe have, initially had a lot less respect for until we tried it. But in trying it out, it turns out its conversion into actual raw cards from Fusion System on Genesect is like 6 to 7 cards sometimes, which is absolutely absurd for just an item. Obviously, there will be those turns, those sort of situations, those games where you don't find it turn 1 or and it just does become a dead card, and that's why we think it will only ever be in a very low count 1, maybe a 2-of at absolute most. But equally, you can kind of compare it to Chili, CIlan, and Cress. And on turn 1, it's like using a Chili, CIlan, and Cress for 2 targets rather than 3, but also tutoring out an exact piece you want in terms of, again, like I say, an extra Quick Ball, an Energy, a Stadium to get into to bounce past the peak, which we think is going to be a lot more prevalent going forward because of how strong Genesect is. And with a Pokegear, like a heavy Pokegear engine, plus Peony, so 4 Pokegears, 4 Peonies, that we're kind of seeing these decks be built around because these Pokegears are insta-playable, you actually do find Peony in a fairly high percentage of games, which means this Battle Pass is pretty live in a lot of games. The other thing is, yes, it's awkward if you prize it, and yes, later down the line, if you draw it as a prize, it's a dead prize, but it's also kind of a pseudo-free prize as well, because in the last stage of the game, it's just dead anyway. You don't need that card, so it's not like you've made your deck more inconsistent because you can't access it anyway. So yeah, it's a really, really interesting card, one that I think Joe and I initially wrote off quite a bit, but the more we've played with it, the more we've been impressed by it, and the fact it can, like I say, just convert into 6 or 7 cards with Genesect, sometimes even more, kind of justifies it as a 1-of in our eyes in the Fusion Strike engines, regardless. So yeah, with Peony and 1 VIP Battle Pass, it really gets you onto the board and gets you going. It's really, really exciting. So I think it's a very nice 1-of in that deck.
Next up, we have Cross Receiver, another Fusion Strike card here, one that we think is maybe a little bit less impressive. It has the text that you can only play 2 at the same time to get the effect of this card, similar to custom catchers you may remember back in the day. And it says, once you've played these 2 Cross Receivers, put a Pokemon or supporter from your discard pile into your hand. So it has that flexibility of one or the other, which is kind of okay. But the biggest issue for me just straight out the gate is that you're having to combine these together. So you need to try and play a Peony, for example, or a Shady Dealings Inteleon to piece these out of the deck just to use them on the right turn, and the effect just isn't all that strong. So you need to sort of warp your deck to make this effect work, just so you can find these 2, and, again, prizing, discarding with research, these can be issues along the way where maybe you only get 1 effect of Cross Receiver. And we already have such good recovery for Pokemon in Ordinary Rod or Rescue Carrier, and already we have great supporter recovery. Eldegoss is just a 1-card option that's also searchable with Quick Ball, so you have multiple outs just to get that, boss back or whatever to use it. We have Chatot with Scoop Up Net as an engine that we've seen, even like Jolteon has been playing recently. Palpad obviously can recycle some stuff, so the only real benefit we could see of a cross receiver is that we could recover this sort of in air quotes endlessly with Smeargle, because Trash Sketch can get back Fusion Strike cards. But we don't really foresee the cross switcher being the best target for this regardless. So overall, it's just not really worth the cost of this annoying play 2 option for the most part.
Next up, we have Cross Switcher, which is on the complete opposite end of the scale. This is another Fusion Strike item, and again, you can only play 2 at once. But if you play 2 at once, it has the effect of the supporter card Guzma. Switch one of your opponent's bench Pokemon with their active, then switch your active with one of your bench. Yeah, this card is absolutely phenomenal. I think even we were surprised as to how good it turned out this card was. Guzma was debatably the best gusting, one of the best supporters ever printed. Adding on Switch to a boss or a Lysander style effect turned out to be very, very strong. We have air balloons, so that's great. We have switches, so we have a lot of different ways to be able to move out of this effect. We have Mew V&VMAX, which has free retreat as well, so it already fits very well in those decks. On top of that, Genesect's attack Technoblast requires you to move. This Pokemon can't attack during the next turn, so you are required to move if your Genesect does survive to be able to use Technoblast again. So it already also synergizes with that, as well as also being able to target up another of your opponent's key Pokemon on their bench, which is fantastic. Can be picked up with Peony in the same way that Receiver could, but obviously this has a much stronger effect. It turns Peony into a Switch plus Lysander, boss, which is very, very strong. So yeah, it essentially just does everything that the Genesect and the Mew decks want to do. It resets Technoblast. It doesn't cause you any issues, and also lets you play a gusting effect with Peony as Peony, but also outside of using your supporter. So you can cross switcher and then Peony for things like power tablets, which we'll discuss in a moment, to increase your damage, or energy switches, energy searches, or quick balls. You can do this. You can gust on top of using your supporter for the turn as well. So yeah, it's absolutely incredible. That's all. It already justifies itself as a 5-star card, but there's also talks of this sort of Smeargle Trash Sketch deck, or even just Smeargle, the Trash Sketch Smeargle plus 3 cross switcher in control to kind of have an infinite loop of control. So on top of all of the just aggressive benefits, it can be used as like a control option potentially. We're not too sold on that side of things, but we don't need to be, because it's so good in the Genesect and the Fusion Strike decks in general. That justifies it as a 5-star anyway. I think this is going to mean that these Fusion decks also get to play a lower count of boss, which again is nice because you don't want supporters in the deck. You don't want them to clunk up the hand. Obviously, these cross switches are also kind of clunky. You have to play 2 at once, but that's fine because you can search for them 2 at a time with Peony and stuff, so that's okay. And obviously, we have various ways of just drawing into them with a lot of Fusion System Genesects on the board as well. So yeah, it really, really synergizes with the whole deck. You can see that the community really like the card as well. It just looks incredibly strong. I think it's kind of funny how different these two sort of play 2 copies cards have turned out. But this one, I think, is sure to be a 4 of in basically every single Fusion Strike deck, and may even get to the point in some Inteleon engines that this is just worth it as well, because you can tutor them out, which is kind of crazy to think. It doesn't even have to just limit itself to Fusion decks. Being able to tutor them out with Inteleon can mean you can find a pair of cross switches or the extra cross switch you need or whatever, as well as a supporter, and be able to like Marnie plus cross switcher in a turn, which just sounds disgusting. So yeah, it's a very, very strong card. I don't think it's limited to just Fusion, but I think even in the Fusion decks alone, it's worth a 5-star to me.
Next up, we have Power Tablet. Again, just throwing the Fusion support at us all in one go here. Power Tablet is essentially Electro Power for Fusion Strikers, where it says, during this turn, your Fusion Pokemon's attacks do 30 more damage to your opponent's active before applying weakness and resistance, and this is, of course, stackable, so you can start raining down tablets on people and reaching silly numbers here. Mew is already one of the highest tempo cards that we have in the game. It feels very similar, actually, to a Victini VMAX, where on turn 2, simply copying Technoblast is that turn 2, 210, really good number here. but now you have tablets that can go over the top. It can help you get through toughness capes, for example, on 2 prizes. It can help you reach VMAXs with the help of Toxtricity, with that max downer ability reducing even further. So even though you're like reducing the hit points of your own Mew, it doesn't matter because you're using the tablets to really push that damage into 1-hit KOs. So yeah, tablet is just a very flexible damage output card. The community obviously agreeing here. They know Electro Power from way back when. It does feel a little bit different here because oftentimes that 210 isn't really close to the VMAXs. And I think there could even be reason to only play like 3 tablets in some of these Fusion Strike decks, especially Mew-based ones. But it just weaves in at nice times here and there where you can do like a 100 damage poke with a Latios rather than a 70 damage poke. And then you can go for Technoblast KOs and that sort of thing. So just weaving them in different spots. You can be flexible here. They're never really super dead. You can just spend them to draw more with Fusion System, which is also great and does lean into this archetype very nicely. So certainly going to be good for heavy Toxtricity based lists of Fusion Strike, whether it's straight Genesect or still playing that Mew package. And will still be reasonable even without those Toxtricities for just making numbers work for you. And yeah, just being flexible damage buff, which is just never a bad thing.
Next up, we have Grand Bell of Remembrance. This is kind of similar to Lucky Egg, in that when the Pokemon VMAX this card is attached to is knocked out, search your deck for a card and put it into your hand. So Lucky Egg draws you up to 7. This kind of, instead of drawing up 7, tutors out the card you need. One, this only works for VMAXs, which is pretty awkward because that already limits the pool of what you can attach this to. Especially as we don't want, like, the natural stage of the game is that we don't want our VMAXs to get knocked out because you only ever get 1 proc of this before you lose the game anyway, in most scenarios. So it's already a lot weaker than a Lucky Egg, which can just go on anything and you can potentially draw 28 cards from Lucky Eggs. This, realistically, you're only ever getting one tutored card from Grand Bell. But on top of that, we already have Inteleon Shady Dealings, which basically can grab anything because you can grab Energy Search to grab Energy. You can grab any kind of Pokemon Search to grab any Pokemon, or you can just straight up grab trainers from Shady Dealings. So already the fact that most of the VMAX engines are Inteleon based and can easily splash in one-off Shady Dealings Inteleon, we can already kind of do this mid-turn anyway. On top of that, there's also Tool Jammer that can disrupt you as well. So yeah, there's just no reason to play this card when we already have like a proactive version that we've seen is already in lists and doing very, very well.
Next up, we have Sponge Gloves, and we've actually trashed every other glove card without much thought. We've said all of the predecessor gloves have been useless, but Sponge Gloves may be different. We're giving it the benefit of the doubt here. Sponge Gloves allows you to deal 30 more damage to your opponent's active water Pokemon, and simply because the Inteleon engine is so wide-reaching, there could be a potential combo here where we could use Greedent VMAX to Big Stocks KO some Sobbles. Now, Echoing Horn is a card, and you know there's Botter's Orders, there's even Toy Catcher as an option. If you can damage the Sobble first and Toy Catcher it up with like Inteleon pings or a Zigzagoon ping, that sort of thing, swing the Sponge Gloves on, Big Stocks, and take a 3-prize KO on Sobble. This is going to be the way to make Greedent very, very dangerous. I think it could be replacing Ice Rider in a Suicune style package. I think it may be a little bit more memey, of course. But Ice Rider is actually worried about the amount of metal in the format with Genesect potentially coming around. But yeah, Greedent gets more dangerous. So the Sponge Gloves doubles up the damage of this VMAX. And let's not sleep on taking 3 prizes on a Sobble. That is silly, but it's also very effective, actually. And as long as these VMAX plus Inteleon style decks remain in the format, which I can't really see going anywhere, these Sponge Gloves have a place, and they can be a tutorable card via your own Inteleon engine in Greedent. So it's memey, it's fun, but as long as Intel is around, it's actually effective. So yeah, look out for Sponge Gloves Greedent combos for 3-prize swings.
Next up, we have Skate Park. Skate Park is a new stadium that says whenever a player's active Pokemon retreats, that player puts any basic energy used to pay that retreat cost back into the hand. So essentially, this is the stadium version of Dashing Pouch. Dashing Pouch never saw any play. So having it on a stadium is better than a tool in some respects. It's worse in some respects. But just look at the array of different Switch items we have. We have Net already. Admittedly, you do lose the energy in that way too, but We also have Air Balloon and Switch, and now Cross Switcher as well. We have an abundance of switching options. We even have Bird Keeper as well. There's loads. So there's just no reason to really need to play more outs to switches, or more like reasons to want to retreat. And we have so many ways of just being able to retreat or move our Pokemon without any issue anyway. So yeah, it's just not really worth the effect. We don't have any many great stadiums right now, but in general there are a lot of decks will be able to find a more useful stadium than this. And on top of all of this as well, the format at the moment is very special energy reliant. So there's actually not that many decks that run a high basic energy count. So yeah, it's even like its pool of decks that it could go in is already quite niche as well. So yeah, it's just not quite got a strong enough effect, especially with the abundance of switching outs we have right now anyway.
Then we have Fusion Energy. I actually touched upon this when talking about Elesa Sparkle, and this provides every color of energy, just like all the other, the rapid and the single strike sort of stuff with the impact and the other one, I can't remember. But regardless, this provides every type of energy, which is great for Mew and for Genesect as some of the main attackers here that you're going to try and use. But on top of that, the Pokemon this card is attached to isn't affected by abilities from your opponent's Pokemon. So you can protect yourself against single strike decks where the Dark Signal won't touch your Pokemon when you have a Fusion Energy attached, which can actually be huge because Mew is weak to Dark, obviously. So it could allow you to get the initiative on them rather than the other way round. It also means that you can't be hit via quick shooting Inteleon, which is going to really slow down the likes of Dragapult, the likes of Jolteon, which are in the format right now. And a ton of other decks that are relying on that Inteleon engine. And interestingly, it can even turn your Genesect back on under Galarian Weezing Lock. It may not be great to attach to your Genesect, but it at least draws you cards and means that you're not affected by this lock, essentially, which is very, very good. So we're mostly giving it the 5-star because of its accessibility with Elesa Sparkle to be this acceleration style option. But having the cream on top of being protected from your opponent's abilities is just absolutely insane. So it's another real way that you can gain an advantage on the opponent, and the lower hit points of Mew isn't going to come into question via like quick shooting and that sort of thing, get you into range of certain attackers. It's just going to be much safer all round. So yeah, a great tool that these fusion decks can also use.
So onto the trainer summary. That's basically it for the trainers. We can see we've got some very, very good ones. Power Tablet and Cross Switcher are the good items. We've got Elesa Sparkle, which looks to be very, very solid, as well as a couple of other interesting ones. And then, as we just mentioned, the Fusion Energy is just really, really good as well. So that's the trainers. Feel free to pause if you want to have a quick summary. And then onto the Vs, starting off with Tsarenna V. This is one that me and Joe have a bit of maybe a soft spot for, and maybe you can see that's why the R rating is slightly higher than the community's. Maybe we're looking at it with rose-tinted goggles, but we actually do think there is some reason to play Tsarenna. Has the attack Queen's Order for 2 energy that does 20 damage, and you discard any number of your bench Pokemon. This attack does 40 more for each bench Pokemon that you discarded. So obviously that's very similar to Mega Gardy. Mega Gardy was a deck that me and Joe played to the hills. We played it so much, so that's again maybe why we have a little bit of a higher rating. But we do think there's actually some sort of reason to play this. It's not completely comparable to Suicune, but in terms of a 2 energy attacker that gives up 2 prizes and has a fairly decent tempo attack, it's pretty similar to Suicune in that way, which is cool. Obviously it's not quite reaching Suicune numbers, but in combination with things like Galarian Zigzagoon and stuff, which you can drop on the board and then discard, you can push your numbers up, you can then rescue carrier them back, and the same with things like Chatot, Pumpkaboo, and even Yamper. There's a lot of different sort of quirky engines you can play with this, which is cool. It means that you can actually start to refill your board quite quickly with some very, very strong utility abilities in things like Zigzagoon and Chatot. On top of that, we have things like Lipard and Crobat, which again are, well, Crobat is a once per turn effect, but again, because we can get rid of it quite nicely, we can use it we can use multiple of them across the game. We can actually play a high Crobat count potentially and be able to not clog our board up, which is nice. Lipard is great for getting rid of things like Cape and stuff, which looks to be pretty important, as well as opponent's capes, but also opponent's tool jammers for our capes. So that's pretty cool. Again, it's a very nice one-off that you can just ditch immediately and translate it into 40 damage. which is pretty cool. And also Leafeon. Leafeon's greening cells. The deck doesn't do anything on turn 1, so being able to greening cells to set up your first Tsarenna or at least get an energy on a second one is really nice, because that kind of sets you up, along with Raihan, for the rest of the game to be 1 energy ahead of where you need to be, which is kind of all the deck needs to do. As long as it has access to basically 1 more energy than it needs to, it's completely fine. And then you can ditch off the Leafeon late game if needs be, just again for damage, so it's not clogging the board anymore. So it's really nice to be able to just get rid of everything you don't need and just really hone in on just these Tsarennas or whatever, which is cool. You can also play captures, which again is going to help buff out the board. It means that you can capture turn 1 to find that Leafeon, which is great, to be able to very quickly tutor more energy onto the board and get going. Capes pushes up to 250, which again, it's not the highest of damage, it's not the highest of HPs, but it's still pretty solid. And like I said, Raihan helps you smooth out the game in the mid to late game. We don't feel it's going to be amazing. It's not going to be Suicune. It doesn't draw cards. It doesn't do anything like that. But there will be games where it definitely just sort of steals, because you're just pressuring sort of 180 every turn. There's no free prizes on your board. They have to go through these Tsarennas. And yeah, they're able to trade up pretty nicely. Also, against some of the grass weak things in format like Umbreon, again, this is going to have a really great time. So yeah, it definitely seems like a really cool, another of these 2 prize tempo options. It also pushes, back when rotation happened, we kind of queried whether sort of Suicune Aurora box with like the Galarian birds and stuff like that would ever be a thing. This is another great tool for that kind of deck that kind of would have worked off of the back of Raihan and Aurora energies and stuff like that. It's another great attacker for that deck as well. So yeah, really, really interesting card. Maybe not as powerful as some of these other 2 energy attackers. It's definitely no Suicune or anything, but we think the deck has merits and can definitely steal wins here and there. And being able to, again, run this really nice engine of being able to reuse Galarian Zigzagoons and Pumpkaboos and Chatops and stuff like that looks to be pretty interesting. So yeah, definitely a fun one. Not going to be breaking the meta, but we think it's definitely worth giving it a go and seeing if you can sort of really try and cause your opponent some headaches by just making them go through these 250 HP Tsarennas each turn.
Next up, we have Chandelure V and VMAX. The V is a 200 hit point basic that has Confuse Ray, just for 1 fire to confuse the opponent's active, and a little Poltergeist for fire and colorless. You do 40 for each trainer your opponent has in their hand. The VMAX is just a souped up version, essentially, where that Poltergeist now becomes a 70 multiplier for the number of trainers your opponent has in their hand. You also have the Binding Heat ability, which is a little bit of extra help here, where as long as this is active, your opponent can't play any Pokemon tool cards from their hand. So you're making sure that there's still a few in there for that Poltergeist, and they can't simply throw them down and get themselves out of range, potentially. So that Binding Heat is nice. It can be a little bit annoying. Could be decent for trapping as well if you wanted to, where you can stop air balloons coming down on some Pokemon if you're trying to struggle and buy a turn here and there, which is kind of okay. And yeah, just hoping that the multiplier is improved by that Binding Heat. Some nice help there. Ultimately, it's a fairly efficient 2-energy attacking Pokemon. Fire really doesn't have much support right now. It's just like Heat, Fire Energy, something like that, which isn't ideal. So comparing it 1-to-1 with Victini, I think we prefer the stable damage more often than not, because we don't have many ways that we can force cards into our opponent's hand right now with the Chandelure. So there's no guarantees that this Poltergeist is going to be doing very sustainable or strong damage. It could be one of those cards that you weave in alongside Victini, because you're already obviously playing fire energies and that sort of thing, where you just hope that after they KO your VMAX, they then naturally have so many cards in hand that a Poltergeist can insta-respond KO, something like that. But you can't even line it up properly at the same time. You know, you may have already hit them with max victory, so just another Victini would have done the job regardless. So yeah, just unreliable right now, unfortunately. If we gain some more hand disruption options in terms of growing the opponent's hand size along with yours or whatever, that would be kind of nice. But as it stands, I think all we have is like an Alcremie that does 1 for each player and something like that. And that's a coming into play effect. It's not like an each turn effect either. So it's convoluted right now to try and make this work, and it's just unstable damage output for the most part.
Next up, we have Crabominable V. This is actually a really interesting one. Crabominable V has 220 HP, and it has 2 attacks. The first is Overturn. This discards the top 2 discard your opponent's deck. This is the one that we're a little bit more interested in. But just quickly, Fist of Destroyer for 3 energy does 90 damage and 60 more for each damage counter on the opponent's active. So essentially, it's Sableye V's attack, but for 1 extra energy, you have base 80 more damage on that attack. Essentially, in terms of that attack, we think Sableye V is stronger because typically the deck can get to the point where it's overkilling stuff anyway. So you're very rarely sort of short of damage when we have things like Quick Shooting and the Glaring Wheezing doing the poison damage throughout the game. So it's rare that you need the extra damage. So having to attach an extra energy is just kind of jumping through extra hoops. As well as not then having you also don't have the Wheezing synergy anymore as well. So we think Sableye is better in that respect. But Overturn actually does look quite interesting. In terms of a control style package, with the new Azumaril that helps you recover supporters and Pokemon from the discard pile, it looks like Control is actually getting some stronger tools, and maybe to the point where it can't even be a contender in the format. We don't think it's going to be super strong, but at the moment it's pretty much non-existent in the hands of anyone but Sander. So maybe this puts it a little bit more on the map. Basically, Crabominable in our eyes just becomes the late game sort of win condition. Once you have 3 turns, or you know your opponent is going to be locked for a couple of turns, you can start using Overturn. You don't really want to have this in the active too early because it's a 2-prizer and you're going to accelerate your opponent's win con. But through the use of things like Sidney and Galamines and bosses and Crushing Hammers, eventually your opponent will start to have a turn here and there where they can't do anything. And basically any turn your opponent seems to be locked, you can find a way of getting this Crabominable into the active. Just start overturning a couple of cards a turn. It's nothing major, but it's going to start slowly whittling away more of their resources, more of their switches, more of their stadiums, more of their energy, to the point where eventually they could be locked out of the game. And yeah, so it looks pretty interesting. At the moment, a lot of these control decks play like a metal package with the new Dialga and Berserker and stuff. We think the Azumaril and Crabominable package is a bit more reliable. It's a bit frailer because Crabominable is worth 2 prizes, but we think if you can get to the point where you're able to use things like Dialga and stuff anyway, you should hopefully be able to be using Crabominable, and from that you have a more stable win condition in discarding 2 cards per turn, plus them drawing a card every turn. So yeah, we've built Control. We're not sold on how it looks yet, but we think there's definitely something there, and it looks a little bit cleaner than Control of current format. So yeah, we're willing. We want to put it out there and say that Crabominable plus Azumaril plus a couple of these other cards can push Zoroark Control into the limelight and up to sort of a low tier 2, high tier 3 deck potentially. So yeah, we're going to give it that 3-star. It looks to be pretty interesting. Obviously, there are these other synergies, as you can see, with things like Frostmoth Inteleon for Fist of the Destroyer, but we think if the card is going to be played, Overturn is going to be the reason.
Next up, we have Inteleon V&VMAX. It's a very interesting rapid striker here. The basic has 200 hit points. It has Surf for 40, which is just from that rapid strike energy attachment for a little prod. And actually, that prod can eventually really help out the VMAX in terms of its damage output, because over 2 turns with Gmax Whirlpool, if you're putting these energies back, you can do 280. So that 40 damage is actually fairly relevant. And then there's Aqua Bullet for 2 water and a colorless. You do 120 and 20 to one of your opponent's bench Pokemon. This rarely ever comes off because of the nature of this build. We are most likely going to be playing 4 Rapid Strike energy and then either 0 or a very low count of water energy. And that's in spite of the amazing ability Double Shooter that the VMAX actually has here. Once during a turn, you can discard a water from hand. If you do, put 2 counters on 2 of your opponent's benched Pokemon. This is actually really supplementary, decent damage here. And I think there's maybe 2 schools of thought that we can go about using this archetype. Firstly, it's going to be where we play no water energy whatsoever, or just like 1 or 2 copies of water energy. Try and get the value of Double Shooter, once or twice a game sort of thing, but mainly have Quad Path, then have 4 Rapid Strike energy and a high Cheryl count, like 3 or 4, and you simply bounce your Rapid Strike energy back to hand with the G-Max Whirlpool attack, doing 140, and you slow roll the opponent by basically Cherylling off and picking up the Rapid Strike over and over again. If they can't dish out big one-hit KOs, they're going to struggle against that sort of approach, especially when you have Rapid Strike Inteleon just quick shooting in the back. That can also improve the G-Max Whirlpool damage output. And a potential other school of thought would be to try and go crazy with Double Shooter and try and have a good amount of water energy in here. Maybe even having something like the Gossifleur Eldegoss package, where you cotton lift waters straight into that hand after using, Gossifleur to try and get multiple Intels out, and then you can try and spam your double shooters, use things like Recycler and Ordinary Rod or those sorts of cards, and have lots of energy sort of raining down and pressurizing the 60-70 hit point Pokemon that we have in play here, whilst also setting up those VMAXs. I think what's most likely to work is going to be the Path deck, just because we know that that's one of the best checks to Fusion Strike straight out the gate, and we know that Cheryl is just very effective for this style of deck. The main Lightning style deck in the game is Jolteon, and its damage output is inherently very, very low, so you can still perform the Cheryl option in that matchup. You may struggle for other reasons, like them dealing with your Octilleries and Inteleons the whole time, but you still have the option to Cheryl through, and it's only really like the new Boltund, for example, where you're too scared of Lightning being a presence in the game right now. So we think as a great Cheryl abuser, this is going to be a strong Rapid Strike deck. And yeah, the community agrees. They think it's also going to be very strong going forward.
Speaking of Boltund, he's the next one on the list. Boltund V, first off, is a 200 HP Lightning type with Smash Turn as its first attack that does 30 and lets you switch. And for 3 energy, we have Electro Bullet with Bullet, which does 120 and a 30 Snipe. Essentially, this is worse in almost all regards than the Electrify Boltund. So we think this is kind of the irrelevant Boltund. It can be maybe useful here and there as a tech, but in general, we would recommend full Boltund V because Electrify really helps out Boltund VMAX's attack, Lightning Storm, which does 30 plus 30 for each lightning attached to all of your Pokemon. So it's essentially Boltund V's attack with a base 30 instead of a base 10, which is really nice because naturally you have more HP, so you're a little bit tankier, and therefore you can probably get off to Lightning Storms rather than just the one with the Boltund, which means you preserve your energy a bit longer, which basically means you double down your damage, which is great. But also we have the Max Bolt attack that does 230 damage for 3, and you can't use Max Bolt during your next turn. This is really good in the early turns, because essentially you're not going to be doing more than 230 with Lightning Storm. There's just no way, because you'd need so many energy in the early turns and so many flaffies and stuff like that to be able to actually reach that. So because of that, we can just use Max Bolt in the early turns to just do some solid damage. Even that attack alone is very, very reliable. 230 for 3 is pretty efficient. And then you can move into the Lightning Storms in the late game, where you've really been able to flood your board with Flaffies and Electrifies and EXP shares and stuff like that. Really been able to retain all of this energy and been able to hopefully be able to get up to that sort of 300, 330 mark, which isn't unrealistic. We have Electrified Boltund for the early turns, which is great. It means that we have an actual useful V Pokemon as our base, which is really good. We have EXP Share to help retain these energies. We have Flaffy to help them get back into play, even if they aren't being EXP shared, which is really good. And we also have Speed Energy, which is just naturally a very, very nice consistency bonus for these Lightning decks. Obviously, there are issues with the fighting decks out there. Single Strike is still very strong, and we think it's going to be pretty strong still going into the next format. Even though it may look a little bit less fighting based, they will be able to just get through you with 2 Single Strike Urshifus, which can be a bit awkward. Obviously, we can trade back into them, but never quite as efficiently because they're only using 2 prizes. And as well as that, Rapid Strike has started to creep up in play again, and is naturally just a very, very poor matchup for us, just because of the easy trade 1 for 300 they have on us. So it does have awkward matchups here and there, and basically it doesn't do anything like super, super broken, but it does enough to be able to really punish decks that miss 1 or 2 turns here and there, because it's just so efficient with Max Bolt into Lightning Storm. You're not doing anything crazy good, but you're just keeping decks honest. You're applying pressure for a very, very simple game plan. There's nothing flashy or anything, and it just means you're super consistent. Being able to run things like Boltund and Speed Energy, which are both really, really good cards for one, thing the deck, and two, drawing extra cards. It's just a really, really nice package. So yeah, it's just a very nice sort of all-round package deck to play. Nothing super broken, but definitely keeps decks honest. And I think it's also a really, really good one for new players as well. So obviously PTCG Live is coming out very shortly. And I think this is a great deck to introduce people to the game to, because there is no real complexity to the deck. The deck has a very simple goal. It's just take 6 prizes using efficient attacks. And it teaches you a lot about the game. So yeah, I really, really like this deck. I think it's great for new players, but I think it holds its own in the metagame as well. So yeah, really excited for Boltund V.
Next up, we have Mew V and VMAX. You may have noticed that we really like Fusion Strike. We've spoken a lot about these cards already and all the support that we have available. Let's not forget that there's Elesa Sparkle as well as the energy that can mean that we're not affected by abilities. We have tablets to increase our damage output, and we have potential for a PNE style engine, so we discard a hand and use Genesect to draw up the entire time. But what does the Mew do? Well, it's a 180 hit point basic 2 prizer, which isn't great. It does have a natural free retreat, which is insane though. That really helps out the Technoblast text of where we can get in and out of the active, which is really nice, which we will be doing with our VMAX because it likes to copy other Pokemon's attacks here. Its first attack is Energy Mixer for a Psychic Energy. You can search your deck for an energy and attach it to one of your fusion Pokemon, then shuffle your deck. This is again really nice. Because we're a Psychic type Pokemon, we're likely to be playing Fog Crystal, so we can have Fog Crystal plus a couple basic Psychic Energy in here, as well as the Fusion Energy themselves to give you the option to attach to maybe another Mew on the bench, or maybe a Genesect, one of those sorts of Pokemon, so that even if something is knocked out, you have energy split around the board and can help you out that little bit against Crushing Hammer, that sort of thing. Similar to how Eternatus has the Power Accelerator option. Not quite as good, but it is at least guaranteed because it's from the deck, which is always pretty good. And then we have the Psycho Jump. For Psychic Colorless, you do 70, and you may shuffle this Pokemon and all cards attached to it back into your deck. And this is actually important to note because you can be copying this with your Mew VMAX. The Cross Fusion attack is kind of the main element of this Mew here, where you can choose the attack on one of your benched fusion Pokemon and use it as this attack. So we have Technoblast, which is a 210 damage output attack, just for 2 colorless energy. So straight away, we can be pressurizing Evolving V Pokemon going first on turn 2, which is crazy, especially because, again, we have Boss's Orders, but we also have PNEs opening up Cross Switcher to enable us to have a turn 2 Gust KO effect, which is just crazy. The VMAX also has free retreat, so you can retreat out and then just find extra switch cards to go straight back into the active if need be. If we've tanked a hit and we want to reset our Mew and go back into the deck and deny prize cards, you can Psycho Jump if need be, which can be a great way to negate damage counters that you've taken, which is just awesome. We also have a Latias attacking option, Dyna Barrier, which does 70 again and prevents all damage done to this Pokemon by attacks from a Pokemon VMAX, and this could be a game changer. For quite a few decks in the game right now, we have the combination of VMAX attacker plus Inteleon sort of supplementary consistency engine, and even with Phoebe in the deck or whatever, and Palpad potentially, the fact that you can Dyna Barrier into Psycho Jump even on turns where they do use Phoebe and whatnot, you can really be awkward for these like just VMAX attacking decks. You force decks to play very differently into you because you can do that boring approach of just Dyna Barrier, Dyna Barrier, Dyna Barrier if need be. Of course, they can gust up the Latias and knock it out, and then you have to take a different approach. But this 70 damage, especially with power tablets, can then push you into KOs with Technoblast and other options here. So that's insane. Speaking of these annoying walling attacks, Mew actually has the inbuilt answer to it as well. The Max Miracle for Psychic does 130, and damage from this attack isn't affected by effects on your opponent's active Pokemon, so you can get through a Latias hitting you or a Mew using Latias if need be. You're not doing a huge amount, but you're at least responding, which is pretty okay. So yeah, a lot to like about the Mew. The Dark weakness is an issue, and Japan still have weakness guard energy, and we don't have that, and that is somewhat of a concern because we know that right now Single Strike is one of the best decks in the game, and that's not really going anywhere. Especially there's also the new threat of Gengar potentially for the Single Strike deck, so be aware of that. But fortunately, the Fusion Strike deck can still, put a shift in with Elesa Sparkle and try and attack with other things when you need to. Or you can just be jumping into the deck and try and promote one prizes and force awkward trades for the opponent as well. So there's just so much to like about the Mew. It's so versatile with the damage reduction, the walling, and just the early tempo that you hit on the board with that Techno Blast that you can copy from Genesect. It's just a really nice inbuilt package. There's just a lot to like here. Very much has the same vibes as like Mewtwo Mew Tag Team GX, where you have these toolbox of options inbuilt, plus you've got the draw from Genesect, plus you've just got those fusion energies to protect you that little bit more. There's just a lot to like here. Really, really strong card, and it's probably going to be the face of one of two directions of Fusion Strike, really, where you have a Mew build and then probably just a quad Genesect build as well. Those are the things that we're eyeing up right now. But Mew certainly is solid. And the free retreat is just absolutely mad as well. I can't believe it also got gifted with that at the same time.
Next up, we have Hoopa V. Hoopa V is another fusion Pokemon. It's actually not in the set as a main V Pokemon, but it is as a secret rare, a bit like the Jolteon and stuff, where it's coming out in a box a couple of weeks after. But we will be able to play with this in terms of the full art. And it actually seems pretty interesting. Has the double face ability, as long as this Pokemon is in play. It's both Psychic and Dark type, which is two great types, to be honest, right now. Now Mew is weak to Dark, I think it's weak to Dark, and Psychic means that we're also able to deal with the Urshis. So two great types. Shadow Force as well is a pretty strong attack, does 170 for 3 energy. You put 3 damage counters on one of your Pokemon, but that's not too relevant in most scenarios. So you're able to hit 2 types of Pokemon for basically 340 damage, so all in all, it's a very, very solid attacker. It's a fusion Pokemon as well, so we have all of the combinations of Elesa Sparkle and the fusion energy and being able to energy mixer onto it and stuff like that. And it seems very, very strong as a one-of tech for the mirror in these Mew decks, because turn 1, you're able to energy mixer. You're able to attach the Mew and then energy mixer onto the Hoopa, and either they deal with the Mew in the active, and you have your Hoopa ready to go if you can find an Elesa Sparkle, or they deal with the Mew and you have a Mew VMAX ready to go with Techno Blast. So it's kind of like a bit of a checkmate situation, and in most scenarios they should be dealing with the Hoopa, because otherwise the Hoopa is going to be able to take 3 prizes on their Mew VMAX. So it's a really nice one-of tech potentially for the mirror. We haven't tried the mirror out too much, and we're not super convinced that it's staple, but it's definitely a good option for you. As well as that, it's also a nice option in Eternatus, because it means that you can hit some of these psychic weak Pokemon that Eternatus naturally would struggle with, basically the Urshis for weakness, which is cool. We're already having to play potentially having to play the Galarian Moltres E-Switch build anyway, so being able to, we can power this up. Not always in one turn, but we do have the ability to power it up in a turn. But it's going to be a little bit harder without things like Weavile that we used to have. But it's still potentially a good option. Obviously, one of the biggest issues with this card is just the existence of Path to the Peak. That's kind of what has kept Eternatus in check anyway. Admittedly, the fighting decks rarely play Path to the Peak, so it's still good in those. But just in general, Eternatus still might not be good enough. It's not like the fighting weakness is what's keeping it down. It's really the Path to the Peak right now. So still might not be good enough to push that deck. But also, we've actually tried out a pretty experimental version of Hoopa, and you may have seen this on the channel actually, pairing it with the Dark Squall Hydreigon from Darkness Ablaze. Basically, we just wanted to absolutely test the limits of Genesect, see how much of an engine we could build off of the back of being able to fusion system. And it had mediocre results. It wasn't groundbreaking, but I think we were both quite impressed with how frequently it was able to get into Hydreigon turn 2. So if you're looking to scratch the stage 2 itch that isn't Inteleon right now, it's definitely an interesting one. And with sort of building off of the back of Genesect V as your draw engine, it's never going to be too terrible of a deck, just because you have such a strong such a huge amount of cards you can draw each turn. So yeah, it's a really interesting one. I think in general, it just doesn't fit anywhere on its own, so that's why we're not going to rate it too highly. But being able to use it as a potential tech option, I think, keeps the card out of the realm of 1 and into the realm of 2. And yeah, it's definitely an interesting one. It's not going to be groundbreaking. There's no great way of accelerating to it right now. But in the exact situation where you're able to energy mixer onto it, it can really present some headaches for the opponent. in the mirror. So yeah, definitely an interesting one. Slightly scuppered by the fact that it just doesn't have a great home, but could still be a really interesting one-of.
Next up, we have Gengar V&VMAX, and you can see we are rating it a little bit below the community. I think there's a lot of hype around this combo. We have some additional single strikers to the mix, essentially. And we know that single strike right now is certainly tier 1. It's among the best decks for sure. And Gengar is a potential other option that we can go down for these sorts of decks. We are a dark type, so we don't gain any extra type coverage. We already have that covered by the Umbreon. So in general, Gengar has to just be outperforming these others just by his own sort of consistency and just being essentially a 1 less energy attack a lot of the time with Panic Fear. First of all, though, the regular V, 210 hit points. It has Dark Slumber that does 40 for 2 Dark, and your opponent's Pokemon is now asleep, and 3 for 190 and 30 to yourself with Pain Burst, which is the same as Galarian Moltres. Don't sleep on that 190, actually. Similar to Single Strike Urshifu V, where you have that 180 damage. It's very similar here, where Gengar, with a couple single strike roars, can be KOing 2 prizes very easily, and you're only giving up 2 prizes yourself. So it is certainly relevant for early tempo and pressure, which I think is always pretty good with single strike, and it allows you to fight the decks like Suicune and whatnot and just try and race, essentially, which is very, very good. But then the VMAX is a 320 hit point single striker. Panic Fear for 2 Dark Energy does 60 times the number of V and GXs in play. Obviously in standard it's just V Pokemon. And yeah, this is a decent multiplier. I think especially when you take into consideration that Fusion Strike will be one of the top decks in the game, and Genesect is very reliant. Well, the Fusion Strike deck is very reliant on Genesect for their draw engine. They basically can't help putting 2, 3 V Pokemon into play. If it's 4 and whatnot, Panic Fear starts getting into very good damage output, and you can even augment that damage with Single Strike Roars as well, if you need to. And then we have the G-Max Swallow attack for 3 Dark Energies, does 250, and this Pokemon can't attack during your next turn. 250, again, it's never the final tail with the deck, because you have Single Strike Roar to push that damage output that little bit more. It is, 20 damage less than the G-Max One Blow, but it is 1 energy less, so a bit of a trade-off there. And of course, if you need to go over the top with additional Single Strike Roars just to get that 4th energy on for damage, you could be doing that with G-Max Swallow. So you're not entirely based on this Panic Fear attack, but it can certainly punish Fusion Strike players. It's pretty good in Mirror as well, because there's usually a number of, Umbreons waiting in the wings to do some gusting and that sort of thing. So keeping your opponent's Vs and whatnot in check is always pretty nice. The one thing I will say is that right now, at least, there's a ton of V decks that just have Inteleon that takes up the majority of their bench. So Panic Fear is only really doing like 120 for 2, plus the single strike energies that you have attached. My biggest gripe, really, is that it's pure dark cost on the entirety of the line. And one thing I love about the single strike deck is that it gets to take advantage of Capture Energy. Such a big card. Now, you could argue that because there's only 2 energy attack cost in Panic Fear, you need Houndooms in play that little bit less, so losing the Capture isn't as detrimental. But Captures also enable, an Umbreon turn 1 or whatever, and when you're the player going second, or the player going first, that can be insane for turn 2 tempo, and you have to strip that away from the deck. You have to then put in things like Hiding Darkness Energy. That actually does improve your matchup into Leafeon, surprisingly enough, where right now Single Strike doesn't really appreciate that matchup too much. There's a high retreat cost on Urshifu, there's weakness on Umbreon, whereas if you actually have the Hiding Darkness Energies on your Gengars, that then becomes a much stronger matchup. So if you're expecting Leafeon to still be a presence, the Gengar could be a great addition. But really the weighing up here is that, do we thin our line of Urshifu? Do we thin our line of Umbreon? Do we squeeze in a thin line of Gengar? Or do we go heavy on Gengar and completely warp the deck all around? So we've tried a little bit of a splash of Gengar. A thicker Gengar makes the deck very different, and then you don't have Capture, which I'm kind of against just because I think Capture's a crazy card. But these are big sort of issues, I think, with the Gengar, which is why we're only putting it as that 3-star option, where it's great if Fusion Strike is rife and if Leafeon is still a presence in the game. That's where Gengar has huge benefits and is very, very strong. You can also use Piers that little bit more effectively, and you know that we've always been affectionate about Piers in Single Strike. But if there's still, if there's Mirror, you want to have Single Strike Urshifu as at least like a 1 or 2 of in the deck, even without a VMAX. If there's still Jolteon in the game, if Boltund's a relevant card, if Eternatus makes any form of comeback, you want to have that fighting type coverage. So I can't look past Single Strike Urshifu. The amount of times I've played Single Strike, I've always enjoyed the Urshi. I think he's been very strong. And I'm a sucker for Capture Energy. I think that's going to still be the bread and butter way to play Single Strike going ahead. Just a few other things to mention. You don't necessarily need to play Houndoom at all with Gengar. You can just have one attachment per turn because you're just a 2-energy attacking VMAX, and then you can go an Abomasnow route, and funnily enough, then you could even try having Scroll of Scorn in your list and be awkward to deal with in that regard, which is fun. And I have seen some Japanese Eternatus lists also teching in like a 1-1 or 2-2 Gengar or whatnot, and for me it doesn't make a huge amount of sense. Eternatus isn't high tier either, so that doesn't change my opinion of it too much. But yeah, that's really my thoughts on Gengar. I love Single Strike as a deck. I just don't think Gengar is a natural include to the deck. It could end up being worthwhile. Again, that sort of caveat that it's very good against Fusion Strike. But I don't think it's mandatory for the deck going forward.
Next up, we have Genesect V. Enough talk. We've discussed this card on basically every other slide so far. So let's actually talk about the card, I guess. Genesect V is a 190 HP Metal-type V Pokemon. It's a fusion Pokemon. So already we're thinking about Elesa Sparkle, Power Tablet, those kind of things. But Fusion System is what it's all about. Fusion System says once during your turn before you attack, you may draw cards from your deck until the number of cards in your hand equals the number of fusion Pokemon you have in play. So, on a board with 6 fusion Pokemon, you can draw up to 6 cards for each of those Genesects that you have. So this ability isn't once per turn, limited to 1 use per turn. We can do it for each of the Genesects. It is stackable. So that means that's essentially why we want to play so many insta-play cards in these fusion decks, because we want to draw up to 6 cards, play a load of cards down, then with another Genesect, draw up to 6 cards, rinse and repeat, and really motor through the deck. Some of the games me and Joe have had, we've gone down to single figures, even like low single figures, 3, 4, 5 cards in deck by sort of turn 3, 4 sometimes, which is absolutely bananas. These decks aren't even playing things like Research. There's just so much draw power from Genesect. They don't need to play things like Research and stuff. It's absolutely bananas. You can, it builds combos. It lets you draw into your support. It means you can play a lower support account, which means you can play more of these power tablets, these capes, all of that kind of stuff, which is really good. And you can use them, again, multiple times per turn. You can use them once for each Genesect, so you can draw up to 24 cards in one turn in an ideal situation, which is insane. That's essentially half of your deck in one turn after you account for opening 7 and prize cards. That's absurd. It's just absolutely nutty. So you can already tell that this has insane draw power. On top of that, it has a really strong attack, Technoblast, that we've mentioned, for fighting, metal colorless. Does 210, and this Pokemon can't attack during your next turn. So it's essentially Zacian's Brave Blade for 20 less damage, but it has a colorless cost, which means we can use Capture Energy, which is, again, is great. It means that you can capture energy onto a Genesect, grab another Genesect, and you're drawing more cards. So you can already see that essentially in this deck, this card is better than Zacian V. Zacian V is touted as one of the best cards ever printed, and Genesect is better in the Fusion deck, exactly. So that's already insane. We can already see that this card has huge merits to it. On top of that, we have Saucer. Saucer lets you get multiple Genesects on the go quite quickly. That, in combination with Elisa's Sparkle, means that you can set up multiple Genesects in a turn and really checkmate your opponent because they can't deal with more than one at once. We have Power Tablets to push that damage from Technoblast up to 240, maybe 270. Those numbers still are quite awkward, but in combination with Toxtricity's Max Downer, which is kind of this quad Genesect deck that Joe mentioned earlier on, they're going to be the fusion Pokemon you have on your bench to fill out your board to go wide to draw lots of cards with Fusion System. These essentially also do a plus 30. So with 2 Toxtricity on the board and 2 Power Tablets, you essentially do 330 for 3 energy. So that's insane. That's a 2 prize Pokemon taking 3 prizes pretty simply, with a huge amount of recovery in terms of Saucer and Elisa's Sparkle to be able to chain that. You also have the Oricorio that we'll discuss in a little bit with the Fervent Lesson ability that lets you reduce 20 damage on all of these Genesects. So that, in combination with Cape of Toughness, makes them basically as tanky as Zacians, which is cool. We even have Smeargle to be able to grab Power Tablets and Cross Switchers back. Cross Switcher lets you reset Technoblast as well. That's worth noting. You can already tell there's just so much to note about this card. It's absolutely insane. And then, on top of all of that, we could play the Mew version of the deck, which basically is the deck, but it has different type coverages. Obviously, you potentially give up one extra prize, but you have access to various different attacks, different typings, a free retreater, and more HP naturally. So yeah, very, very interesting stuff. We've played about a week of this format so far pretty solidly, and every single game Genesect has sort of shocked us further as to how much you can actually do with this card. It's absurd. You can draw so many cards with this, and it kind of pushes the archetype into tier 1 regardless of any other aspect of the deck. The thing is, every other aspect of the deck is also absolutely fantastic. So yeah, very, very exciting card. I think me and Joe both think it's the best card in the set, and it's a very, very deserving winner. It's going to really warp the way the meta is built. There's going to be a lot more path decks. There's going to be decks are really going to basically have to work out how they can deal with the Genesect, potentially with 260 HP turn after turn, because otherwise they're just going to be able to overrun you with tablets and cross switches and stuff. Yeah, it's absolutely insane. It's definitely going to join the format in the very, very high tiers, and I, for certain, am going to be picking up some of these because I think they are debatably one of the best Pokemon cards ever printed. I think Genesect is absolutely bananas.
Next up, we have Greedent V&VMAX. A bit more of a fun one, but certainly interesting, actually. And it's really the big stocks attack on the VMAX itself that has most people talking about it. And you can see the ratings here. Some people are calling it 4 or 5 stars even. And it says, for 2 colorless, deal 30 damage. If your opponent's active basic Pokemon is knocked out by damage from this attack, take 2 additional prize cards. So there is that option straight away that you can knock out something like a Houndour or a Sobble and take a huge 3 prize cards for it. And it means that really your map becomes very, very different to most other decks, where you can try and weave in cards like Echoing Horn and Toy Catcher, potentially, or just Boss's Orders, good old-fashioned, and take really cheesy routes to take knockouts with the help of powerful colorless energy, Sponge Gloves potentially. You can increase that damage output. Also, obviously, quick shooting will be on your side because you're most likely going to be using these Drizzles and Intels to get your combo pieces together in the first place. But quick shooting, again, puts things into range for you to then take those additional prizes, which is just absolutely insane. Like, straight away, it just changes a map completely where you need to deal with 1 VMAX and then just a random attack anywhere wins you the game, basically, which is just insane. We've tried it with Suicune. We think Melanie is a natural way that you can get Greedent powered up in a turn. Suicune is good early tempo in general. We know that Suicune Inteleon wins games on its own just by being aggressive and consistent. And then having this mini package of Greedent in here, likely, you know, a 2-2 line probably, and just have the option for the big stocks to be the end game, could really make your opponent play differently. They maybe don't put down any Sobble for the remainder of the game, and that then just means that they don't have their own engine online, that sort of thing, which is just absolutely crazy when you think about it. Then there's also a max greed attack option for 3 colorless. You do 160 and draw 3 cards. It's something that you can use. Again, it could be finishing off an attack after a Blizzard Rondo, that sort of thing. So there's also just the fact that you are a high hit points VMAX that can, you know, be much chunkier than a Suicune in the late game to make it difficult for the opponent to close out, and you can 2-shot VMAXs at the very least, having this big stocks option as you know, as your fallback as well, which is just really, really good. So it's very bad against the Fusion Strike stuff, and if Fusion Strike becomes like 15-20% of the meta, this is very, very bad. But if Intel plus VMAX decks are still around, there's a place for big stocks, and I think it's got a lot of potential just because we know that Suicune is insane, and that's going to really pull the Greedent up in the game. I think maybe there's a chance that you can make a full-on like 4-3 Greedent VMAX style deck with a ton of Inteleons, a ton of powerful colors and that sort of thing, but you get into meme territory there where you really have to be facing one of those archetypes and it's just like completely useless otherwise. But do bear that in mind. And the regular V is a small upgrade from the V that we already have in the game, where you can flip for paralysis and Greedy Fangs can draw 3, but realistically you're in panic mode if you're using that V to attack with. You're going to try and use Suicune for the most part to get this going and have some very stylish ways to win in the late game. And I don't even think it's like that memey. I think it's actually reasonable when you compare it to something like Ice Rider potentially, when you're terrified of Genesect being a threat in the game, especially when Elesa Sparkle's an option for them at any point. So yeah, I think Green could be overtaking Ice Rider in Suicune. But there's that big caveat that it's terrible if Fusion Strike is the best deck in the game, and it's terrible if these VMAX plus Inteleon decks get bullied out by Fusion Strike just by the virtue of Latias and Mew combo, meaning that the VMAX plus Inteleon deck that we've come to see as like the gold standard for archetypes right now, outside of Single Strike, that could be shifting just because of Mew on its own. So that then makes Greedent's, his game plan look a lot weaker because there's a lot less Intel engines to prey on, essentially. So that's where the question mark comes in. That's why we don't rate it higher, even though we can see it going into an already very strong deck in Suicune.
So let's take a look at the V&VMAX summary. Basically, you can see that we are very, very excited for the Fusion Strike package. The Inteleon line seems pretty good. The Gengar and Greedents both seem like they definitely have places, and then Crabominable and Tsarenna look like they'll have a decent time as well as Boltund. It's actually a really, really good set for Vs and VMAXs. Essentially, the only real dud is the basic Boltund V and maybe the Chandelure line. Everything else looks like you're going to be pretty happy pulling at least one or two of. So yeah, pretty good stuff. And then onto the one prizes, kicking things off with Accelgor. Accelgor is a fusion Pokemon as well. The 90 HP grass type with the Ninja Tornado attack that says that does 120 damage, and if this Pokemon was on the bench and became your active Pokemon this turn, this attack can be used for grass energy. Essentially, this could be a nice 1-1 line, maybe even a 2-2 line in some of the fusion decks, just as a nice Umbreon. As a nice option to deal with Umbreon, because with a power tablet, as long as they've attached a energy via Houndoom to the Umbreon to try and deal with your Mews, you can respond with Ninja Tornado for 1 energy, 1 fusion energy even, and a power tablet, deal 300 and take 3 prizes. Very, very nice, ultimately very, very niche, and we don't think it's actually worth the space in the Mew deck, but it is worth noting if it gets to the point where Umbreon is just the one and only sole counter to Mew, but it is a very successful counter, we do have an option in a thin Accelgor line that can actually trade up very favorably, and then from there you've just got your normal cross fusion plus power tablet plays to be able to get through the other 3 prizes. So yeah, an interesting one. Probably not going to see any play realistically, but is worth noting that it can quite easily deal with an Umbreon VMAX that's taken some damage from Single Strike Raw.
Next up we have Butterfree, an interesting stage 2 that actually has a very good Caterpie and Metapod in the game, both having adaptive evolution, allowing you to evolve the first turn that these Pokemon came into play. So you can go Caterpie, Metapod, straight into Butterfree, all in one turn, and take advantage of the Tricolor Scales ability. When you play this Pokemon from your hand to evolve, you may leave your opponent's active burned, confused, and poisoned. So straight away, that's a 30 damage mod, and also confused at the same time. And then they're also flipping for that burn afterwards. So it's a decent damage modifier, realistically, and it's pretty early game as well, especially when you consider Turffield Stadium as an option to search out these pieces in those opening stages. You can just drop it all in one turn and get that Butterfree buff. Also, you can use Scoop Up Net and then immediately put it all back down to try and use Tricolor Scales all over again. So really, you could get away with playing, like 4 Turffield in a 2-2-2 line or something like that of the Butterfree and try and get it rolling quickly. The one thing I will say is this is way more slots and way more work than something like Yellhorn, which is getting that confusion effect off. And we know and love Inteleon. We know it's busted. And quick shooting, especially getting 2 of them into play, will always beat out Butterfree. So it's just much more flexible damage, and even though it's like 1 physical less counter on the active Pokemon, you take that for the fact that you could stack your Inteleons where you can't really with Butterfree either. So unfortunately, just in an era where Inteleon is crazy, but there's actually a lot to like about the Butterfree. I think it's a very cool option, but there isn't really many decks already playing Turffield where you can take advantage of this and then it ticks over your damage that little bit better. Maybe buying an extra turn with an Orbital just via the confusion could be interesting or whatnot, but ultimately it's a lot of space just for that sort of gimmick.
Great art though. Next up we have Maractus. Maractus has a very similar effect, or a very similar attack to Baby Blacephalon, so immediately we had to all brace ourselves just in case. Ditch and Shake does 50 times the number of tools you discard from your hand. So obviously, that's the same as energy. That's the same attack that Blacephalon had, but for energy. Does it for 2 energy instead of 3. But admittedly, we don't have energy acceleration outside of sort of Raihan or whatever for Maractus. So it's not quite as efficient as being able to just weld or attach to a Blown and go for a 300 damage out of nowhere. So that's probably a good thing, in all honesty. We have a couple of supplementary Stage 1 Pokemon we could run with it. We have the Garbodor that currently is in format that has a Trash Cyclone attack that does 30 for each tool in your discard pile. You then shuffle them into the deck, so that's kind of could be your late game sweeper, could be just used as a reload mid game. Obviously, you're a one prize deck, so it means that maybe you do have chance to go for multiple Maractuses and build up your build up a game plan like that. We also have Granbull, which has the Grasp ability that says when you play this Pokemon from your hand to evolve one of your Pokemon, put up to 2 tool cards from your discard pile into your hand. So that's essentially plus 100 damage for this turn. So that's pretty nice, as well as just being naturally capture energy synergy, naturally having capture energy synergy. It means that we can actually flood the board with these Maractus plus Snubbles or Trubbishes and stuff, and get onto the board quite quickly. So it's an interesting sort of archetype. The kind of tools that we can see being discarded or being in the deck at least are things like Lucky Eggs, to hopefully be able to draw into a lot more cards, a lot more tools for the next turn when your Maractus gets knocked out. EXP shares for the other Maractuses on the bench so that we can kind of hopefully chain these. Again, a lot less reliable than Welder, but EXP share is kind of the best we have other than Raihan, as well as Air Balloon, just to kind of give our board some flexibility. Essentially, it's just too inconsistent. It's nowhere near as scary or intimidating as Blown was. It can reach some interesting damage, like it can reach up to the sort of the 300s, as Baby Blown was used to, but it's Baby Blacephalon did sometimes struggle pushing into the 350s and stuff. And I think when it's not your energy, when you're having to fill your deck with other cards, it's a little bit less ideal. Obviously, you don't have to sort of use these energy on your board, or use these cards on your board if you don't want to, whereas you always needed to be attaching to these Blowns. But essentially, it's just not as consistent as Blacephalon was. The cards that you naturally get to play in your deck were weaker than just some of the cards that Baby Blown got to play, and naturally it just has a much worse engine. It's harder to chain these, and all in all, it's just sort of a really toned down version of Baby Blacephalon, which I think for everyone's sanity is probably a good thing. But yeah, unfortunately that means Maractus is going to drop down to a 1-star and is not quite going to tear up the format like Baby Blown did once upon a time.
Onto the fire types, we have Oricorio. It's a fusion striker, and it's likely just going to be an instant addition as a 1 copy into either the Mew deck or the Quad Genesect deck. The Fervent Lesson ability allows you to take 20 less damage from your opponent's attacks for your Fusion Strike Pokemon. And this is, basically the reverse of a Diancie Prism Star, essentially. This is not stackable, but it's just an easy way to reduce 20 damage, so defensive rather than offensive from a Diancie. But yeah, just a natural one-of include seems to be pretty obvious here, because straight away, your Genesect, the low hit points on Genesect, the low hit points on Mew gets counterbalanced, and it can push you out of damage ranges here and there, which is always pretty nice, especially when Mew can jump back into the deck when needs be as well. So just in general, the deck is hungry for Fusion Strike Pokemon to fill the board. You do have to weigh up whether this is more or less helpful than just having another Genesect for potential more fusion systems. But just the go wide approach, this certainly does help out, especially when you add in things like Cape of Toughness to the Genesect and that sort of thing. And let's not forget about Passionate Drop as well, because Mew can copy it if needs be. It allows you to place 5 counters on your opponent's Pokemon in any way that you like. This could be in situations where potentially you haven't got a Boss's Orders on the right turn, but you can just put things in range of a ton of power tablets to spike you the following turn, that sort of thing. So that could be very reasonable. And it could, in certain situations, mean that you don't need Boss or Cross Switcher to close out the game. So let's not sleep on Passionate Drop. There'll be times where you even use this effect as well, as just being natural damage reduction, which is better than basically every other Fusion Strike Pokemon as a one-prizer that would otherwise just be vanilla on the bench. This gives you an additional little bit of help.
Next up, we have Ninetales. Ninetales is a Stage 1 Fire type with the ability Secret Path of the Fox. As long as this Pokemon is in play, the retreat cost of each of your Pokemon that has any fire energy attached to it is 2 less. Essentially, this is a really nice ability, but there's just no reason to play it right now when we have so many ways of retreating, similar to one of the cards I said earlier. I can't remember which card it was, but essentially, we have so many ways of moving right now. Being able to retreat... Oh, it was Skate Park, that was the one. Essentially, we have so many ways of moving around and stuff like that. This ability isn't going to be too impactful. It's essentially the same as Zeraora's, but Zeraora was a basic Pokemon as well, which is very relevant. So yeah, unfortunately, it's just not really good enough. Great cube card, but other than that, unfortunately, not really going to see any play in Standard.
You found me out. That's why it's on here. Next up, we have Heatmor, a very interesting basic Pokemon, actually. Definitely one for the memes and the highlight reel moments. The Fire Gathering does 20, and you can attach a fire from the discard to this Pokemon, but Elated Flame is super interesting. For Fire Colorless, you do 90, and if this Pokemon has at least 3 extra energy attached to it, in addition to the cost, you get to do 180 damage to one of your opponent's benched Pokemon. So it's a mini Tag Bolt GX, essentially. And in theory, you could do this multiple times in a game, as long as you could somehow get enough energies onto your Heatmor. Now, we do have Cherrim in the game, where you can Spring Bloom 4 energies of being grass, and then you only need to get yourself 2 fire into play. And we actually already have Regidrago, which is already a grass and fire combo here to get the dragon energy attack off. So in theory, it's all there for you. And as long as you can build it and get the highlight reel going, yeah, it's there. This could be a good way to win single prize mirror matches or just set things up for dragon energy to then finish off. And, you know, the 180 could be knocking out a Crobat, could be knocking out a one prizer, it could be setting up their next V or VMAX or whatever. So yeah, if ever it happens, Heatmor has a crazy effect. It's only a 1-star because we think it happens, you know, 1 in 25 games, something like that.
Next up, we have the Everybody Rollout deck. This Everybody Rollout deck is essentially the one prize archetype that they try and add into each of these sets. This is this set's sort of build out of the box kind of archetype. Essentially, the Everybody Rollout attack is on Marill, Sandshrew, Jigglypuff, Wooloo, and Togedemaru, and they each, for 2 energy, 2 colorless energy, do 20 times the number of benched Pokemon that you have that has the Everybody Rollout attack. So essentially, in an ideal situation, we're going to be doing 2 for 100. The idea is we have 5 different types. We can hit 5 different weaknesses, or I guess 4, because since Wooloo can't hit a weakness, I guess 4. So essentially, we're doing 4 different weaknesses for 100. Times that by 2 is 200. The idea is essentially to be trying to trade up into these 2 prizes and 3 prizes. Now, the Blissey has the Rounded Skill ability that says each of your Pokemon with the Everybody Rollout attack takes no damage from the attacks of your opponent's Pokemon VMAX. So essentially the idea of the deck is to drop a Blissey down, force your opponent to not evolve their VMAXs, because realistically, because we're a 1 prize deck, the opponent's not going to have enough Palpads plus Phoebes to be able to get through all of your 1 prizes. Even if they start targeting down the Blisseys, you can find more Blisseys, and since Blissey also has Everybody Rollout, it means that you're not wasting damage by benching more Chanseys and stuff to evolve them. So essentially, in our eyes, any of these decks won't have enough ways through via Phoebe plus Palpad to get through Rounded Skill. There will be certain ones like the Mew VMAX that just cut through all effects, and already those are going to be very bad matchups. But basically, any VMAX deck that doesn't have a Shred style attack is not going to be able to get through enough of these Pokemon, so they're going to be limited to not evolving their VMAXs and evolving their V Pokemon. Attacking with their V Pokemon. Some of these are pretty inefficient. Some of these take a lot of energy, and some of them will have weakness. On, and if we do, we can be doing 200 and sometimes being able to get some knockouts here and there. Anything with 200 or less, 190, 180, any of that kind of stuff. We're going to be able to trade up for just a Twin Energy, which is nice. Essentially, it's kind of a meme archetype. We've seen that Decidueye and Altaria are not really doing particularly well right now. Now, being able to get Rounded Skill on the board essentially means that you have your whole board covered by sort of Miraculous Charm or a Deep Forest Camo style effect. So because of that, it's a bit easier to chain these, and it's not as inconsistent as trying to get multiple Decidueyes and Altarias up. And that's why we've given it that 2-star, because there will be certain situations, certain matchups, where your opponent just can't get through enough of these 1 prizes to be able to win the game. It's not going to be very many, and given that Mew has the Max Miracle attack that has the Shred style effect, immediately, if that's like, again, 15 to 20% of the meta, which we expect it could be, it's that strong, or at least 10% in terms of that Mew deck in particular, plus things like Dragapult, Inteleon, all of those kind of stuff, they're going to be the difficult matchups. some of these other matchups are going to be pretty free because, like we say, you're just not going to be able to get through enough one prizes, and that's going to push it into that 2-star category. But essentially, it's just going to be a fun, again, highlight reel style deck. It's going to be not particularly consistent, not particularly sort of broken because you're capped at 100 essentially. But there will be games where your opponent just turns over, and if you get a couple of rounded skill blissies out, they just can't do anything. So yeah, it's a fun one. It will frustrate people, but it's never going to be top of tier 1, let's say that.
Next up we have Azumaril, and Jack mentioned this when talking about Crabominable. We believe this could be the new face of the Zoroark control package. The diving rescue attack is really what we're looking at here. For 1 water, you can choose up to 3 in any combination of Pokemon and supporter cards from your discard pile, show them to your opponent, and put them into your hand. This is very good for 1 attachment. Getting 3 cards back, just physically straight away, 3 cards back to hand is a lot of value because you're constantly churning and burning your hand with these sorts of control decks with Cinccino's. So just physically 3 cards back into hand is great. But Control loves getting back supporter cards. We know this when Lusamine was a loop for these sorts of archetypes, that 1 use of a supporter, when done like 20 times in a row, is going to really, really hurt a lot of archetypes. And we think there is starting to become enough of these cards in the game where it could then be the basis of an archetype, where we could be grabbing back Yell Grunts every single turn, grabbing back Boss's Orders and combining it with Galamine. Even the new Sidney supporter that we mentioned earlier, getting rid of special energies, tools, and stadiums. Having this plethora of supporters that you can loop over and over again with this diving rescue is really, really annoying. Similar, really, to the likes of Sableye that we've seen in the past, the likes of Oranguru and Excadrill. This could be the new generation of recovery that we then loop into. The reason why we mentioned Zoroark is then it opens up the door for us to, have all these other stage 1s as a package, and that's how we're seeing Control right now. And yeah, we imagine that Azumaril will possibly overtake the metal package that we have right now, which is Dialga and Galarian Berserker. That Azumaril outraised this. And what I also like is obviously it has the option for Pokemon, and this is naturally great with Zoroark, where you want to get back your next Zorua, your next Zoroark piece that naturally put themselves into that discard pile. But it means you can also play 1 or 2 counts of tech Pokemon, like Morpeko and Crabominable. You can throw them away easily with Cinccino at any point in the game, knowing that on the opportune turn, you can Azumaril straight for them back to then use the following turn. So a bit of foresight, bit of planning in there. But in general, we think this is probably the scariest combination because Crabominable discards cards, because Azumaril is so efficient at recovering these really annoying supporter cards. Like, there can be times in games, if you've just hit enough heads on Crushing Hammer or used enough Crushing Hammers, there's a time when your opponent is playing a multiple energy attachment deck that a Yell Grunt every single turn stops them attacking you full stop. And Azumaril simply rescuing back Yell Grunt every single turn is going to achieve that combo for them. And they can accumulate other things in the background as well, where they can be disruptive and simply just have more cards than you at the end by rescuing enough cards back and then slamming a Marnie or whatnot. So yeah, I think Azumaril is going to be the face of Control, which we think is probably going to be not super high tier. It's not obviously insane, but it is certainly an upgrade from where it is now, to the point where we think it's probably going to be a mid-tier contender when piloted by Control experts, essentially, is what we're trying to say here.
Next up, we have Feraligatr. Feraligatr is quite underwhelming, but it is a bit of a hark back to I think it was one of the Neo Feraligatrs that had a very similar ability. The ability Berserk says when you play this Pokemon from your hand to evolve one of your Pokemon, flip a coin. If heads, discard the top 5 cards of your opponent's deck. If tails, the top 5 of yours. So obviously a big risk sort of coin flip attack, ability. Unfortunately, it's just not worth this kind of ability on a stage 2. It takes too much. It's too much work to try and get this into play. We already have this kind of attack in the Zoroark engine with the Risk Taker Toxtricity if we really want to go for that. And in combination with that, we have Glimwood Tangle, which is going to up our percentage to 75 rather than a 50-50. So essentially, it's just a worse version of Toxtricity, which already isn't seeing any play, and even that card is outclassed by Crabominable in our eyes. So in general, it's just going to be a bit of an interesting one. Again, maybe it's a cube. Maybe it pushes Feraligatr for the cube lovers out there. But in terms of standard, it's not quite worth the payoff for getting a stage 2 into play just for this coin flip effect.
Next up, we have Swampert. Swampert is very poor, actually, and confusing to me why it's even printed like this. Mudmaker, once during a turn, you can attach a water or fighting energy from your hand to one of your Pokemon. It's limited to 1, so it's way worse than Rain Dance. And we already have Stage 1 Rain Dance for the Water archetype. So, bizarre. Really, really bizarre that they printed this ability on a Swampert. We already have better fighting acceleration as well in Colossal. Swampert's attack Earthquake does 180 and 20 to each of your bench, which is downside on a Stage 2. Crazy that this card was printed, honestly. It serves, like, no purpose. It's slower than Frostmoth. Frostmoth isn't even working right now in the game. Yeah, it's a real head-scratcher. I don't know why this card was printed.
Next up, we have Gorbyss, and Gorbyss is one that is actually really, really interesting for a number of reasons. First off, well, essentially it's a fusion Pokemon with the Rapid Strike Canceller ability that says as long as this Pokemon is in play, your opponent's Rapid Strike Pokemon have no abilities. So essentially, this means in most, if not all cases, Rapid Strike Inteleon doesn't have an ability, and also in niche cases, Rapid Strike Octillery doesn't have an ability. Both of those are seeing a lot of play right now. Octillery looks to be going sort of, plateauing in play. It's currently played in Sylveon. Might be played in this new Inteleon deck, but we know the quick shooting Inteleon is in like 70% of decks right now. So being able to turn off their quick shooting is going to be really, really good. It means that they can't modify their damage, and a lot of the VMAXs that Inteleon is paired with cap at that sort of 280 range. So being able to turn off their damage manipulation means that essentially you're turning their 2 shots into 3 shots, which is great. On top of that, well, sort of the only reason that we maybe wouldn't look at playing this is because current sort of iterations of Control, primarily, as well as a couple of other decks, are playing a Jolteon memory capsule package that turns off all Water-type Pokemon's abilities. So that would also turn off the Shady Dealings side of the Inteleon line, which is better than Gorbyss, but it requires finding the memory capsule as well. So you can kind of see in these Control decks, that's why I've got the Zoroark on here, in these Control decks, that are currently playing Jolteon, they may decide to move away from that and into Gorbyss, which is obviously one less card, one less piece that we need to find sort of a combination of to get going. It means that we don't need 2 things to be able to get Ability Lock on the go. We can just find the Zoroark and transform into the Gorbyss, which is good. In combination with the Huntail that Joe will discuss momentarily as well, essentially this can mean that the Single Strike as well as the Rapid Strike decks have a bit more of a difficult time against Control, and I think Rapid Strike in particular, the Inteleon line, could be quite problematic. Obviously, being able to Shady Dealings is still a bit of an issue for Control, and I think there will be legitimate reason that some people will prefer to play Jolteon Memory Capsule, but I think it's honestly potentially worth just trying this out in some other decks other than Control as well, because there's so many decks playing Quick Shooting Inteleon right now. Being able to turn off their abilities is really strong. The one kind of downside of this is in these Fusion decks that are playing Fusion Energy already. Essentially, the Fusion Energy does the same ability, or it does the same thing as Gorbyss, because it means that they can't be using Quick Shooting on any Pokemon with Fusion Energy attached. Obviously, that doesn't turn off Octillery, but it does mean that essentially half of their abilities are going to be useless anyway. So there is a bit of anti-synergy, but it's going to be like, this feels like a tech card that doesn't necessarily have to go in a Fusion deck. So I still think it's definitely worth giving it a try, especially if these Inteleon engines are giving you a headache. And I think it is a really interesting option for the Zoroark Control decks that are currently playing Jolteon as a thinner option, less sort of space-inducive option, but it does do slightly less than the Jolteon. But obviously takes 1 less card and is less combo reliant. So yeah, really interesting one that can kind of be splashed into anything. And in combination with Huntail is a nice little package to put in pretty much any deck, in all fairness.
So let's talk about the Huntail, and obviously Jack did just mention the Gorbyss. Both are able to evolve from Clamperl, so you can easily play a 2-1-1 line if you really want to. This time we're punishing single strikers, where we force an extra colorless in their attack cost once you've evolved into this Huntail. So yeah, again, it could be an option for a Control deck where, because we're already playing hammers, we're already playing fans, that sort of thing in Control, Huntail just forcing an extra energy onto the board can be great. It means they can't just beat you with, like 1 Houndoom coming into play. You can force them to put more in, and, then they're getting cards out of their own deck and Houndoom has a high retreat cost and all this other stuff. So it can really help out Control just putting this into play. And again, Zoroark can transform into it, and it can just be fodder when not useful. But this could, again, be helpful for actually the Fusion Strike decks, where we're pretty scared, actually, of Single Strike because of the type coverage that Mew has. So again, could easily be a 1-1 or a 2-1-1 line of Huntail, Gorbyss sort of thing. To protect yourself at that little bit from just a turn 2 Gengar coming down and taking a big KO, or Umbreon gusting and taking KOs. This Huntail can be some protection, which would be pretty nice for you here and there. There actually are some hammer-based builds of Mew in Japan as well, which makes me very nervous and scared because I'm completely bored of hammer at this point. But yeah, a Huntail could again be a best defense when you combine it with hammers to improve the single strike matchup. So it may be a necessary evil if single strike is really the only other deck that can compete massively with Fusion Strike and be one of the only favorables in the game. Huntail Crushings could flip it back on its head, so be aware of that option going forward. We don't think it goes straight in. We think right now it's probably, you know, just Mew's, Genesect, and possibly Toxtricity, but Huntail is an alternate route, especially if you're terrified of Single Strike.
Next up we have Pyukumuku, a really interesting one. The Pyukumuku Fling ability says once during a turn, if this card is in your hand, you may put this card on the bottom of your deck and then draw one card. You can't use one of this ability during your turn. So essentially, it's just a free draw every turn, as long as it's in the hand and there's no sort of ability lock or anything. It's a bit like the Unknowns of the past, but you don't need it on the board, or you don't need board space or anything. You can just pop it to the bottom of the deck, so that's really cool. We've seen things like Judge's Whistle in the past. People really highly rated Judge's Whistle, saw it as essentially meaning your deck only plays 56 cards. Which in a game like this can be really, really strong. Unfortunately, with Judge's Whistle, it turned out having the raw potential of those 4 cards was better than just playing less cards and drawing into you your other ones quicker. So it turned out it wasn't really worth it in a lot of decks. It was worth it in some decks, but it wasn't really worth it in a lot of decks. But yeah, it's a really interesting one. Essentially, we feel like the Drizzile engine is just almost better than it in most scenarios because you can just find what you need. Drawing 1 extra card a turn is not irrelevant, but most of the time you have to, because this goes to the bottom, you have to find a way of shuffling a deck and then drawing it or tutoring it out with a level ball or something like that. And most of the time it's just better to get a Drizzile to be able to tutor the exact card you need out. As I mentioned earlier on, with Energy Search and Quick Balls and Evo Incenses and stuff like that, essentially Drizzile can access every single card in your deck. So looking to go for a Pyukumuku to draw 1 random card is almost always worse than the Shady Dealings. So yeah, it's essentially not good enough right now, but there is something very, very interesting about it, and I think that even though this is only a common, we would recommend just holding on to this one because it could be interesting as a one-of in certain decks. It's very difficult to say what kind of decks these would be because the ability is so unique. And even though it is a 1-star and we can't see it going anywhere right now, it's only a common, you're not going to get much for disenchanting it, so hold on to it. It may turn out to be a nice one-off here and there in certain decks some way. So yeah, hold on to it for now, but not quite good enough in the current format, we don't think, but very, very interesting.
Next up we have Toxtricity, a really nice Fusion Strike option, actually. Quick note on Toxel, it's lightning type, which is great because Stormy Mountains could actually be one of the go-to stadiums for the Fusion Strike decks. We're really looking for stadium bounces to path. We're terrified. Genesect is a huge element of our draw engine, so just having anything with upside is important, and Stormy Mountains could be just that option to then get you Toxels into play, to give you, you know, just board fill in the opening stages to make Fusion System live and drawing you as many cards as possible. So that's already good. Just the fact that Toxel's lightning type and we're looking for good stadiums. I think possibly something like Shopping Center is something we've tried with Genesect, actually with a split of Stormy Mountains. And I think Mew decks are likely to play Old Cemetery, but they could also, if they want to play Toxtricity in their list, use Stormy Mountains themselves, because Toxtricity is dangerous. That Max Downer ability only works if all of your Pokemon in play are fusions, but it says that as long as this Pokemon is in play, the hit points of your opponent's VMAX is 30 less. And this is stackable. You can have multiple Toxtricity in play, reducing 30, 60, 90 potentially as well, even if you go thick on the Tox. And I could easily foresee, you know, 2-2 lines, 3-2 lines, as high as like 4-3 lines maybe with this Toxtricity. with Stormy Mountains, maybe even with CIlan, Chili, and Cress as well. These could easily make it into the Fusion Strike decks because we are hitting that 210 mark with Technoblast, and then you start throwing tablets at it, you start throwing Toxtricities at it, and suddenly you're getting big one-hit KOs. So a dangerous card. We're looking for Pokemon to fill our bench, and Toxtricity just might be the one. We think it's not guaranteed in the Mew deck, but we think it's very likely if there is going to be a attacking Genesect build that Toxtricity will be that partner.
Next up, we have Deoxys. Deoxys is a very, very interesting one because it's a Fusion Strike, a Single Strike, and a Rapid Strike Pokemon all in one. So it gets the benefits of all of those. It gets Houndooms to power it up. It gets Rapid Strike Energy for the 2 energy in 1. It gets Fusion Strike Energy to be immune to stuff and can use Power Tablets and stuff. So that's really, really interesting. Photon Burst also does extra damage if there are any Fusion Energy attached to it. It does 80 plus 80 more for each. Well, sorry, 80 plus 80 if you have a Fusion Energy attached. So that's 160. With a Power Tablet, that's 190, which is, again, a really good number. But essentially, the way we see this card, essentially, well, doing anything in its lifespan is probably in kind of a Single Strike one prize box deck that we've kind of built and tried before on the channel. And honestly, it wasn't terrible. It wasn't as good as the Single Strike 2 prize options. But if you want to go purely one prizer, it wasn't awful. And essentially, this is another weakness for that deck. We've kind of seen that the format looks at fighting Dark and Psychic as 3 big types right now. So you can then hit these Psychic Pokemon or the Psychic weak Pokemon for double damage. Does mean you probably have to add in Fusion Energy to the deck, which is a bit awkward because it means that you're already running kind of a bit of an inconsistent deck and you're having to add in an extra type of energy. But you can Elesa Sparkle them on, and then in combination with Houndoom plus a regular attachment, you can actually get a Photon Burst out of nowhere and be doing 160 times 2, 320 on some of these Psychic weak Pokemon, which can be very, very strong. So yeah, really, really nice damage. Essentially, that deck just doesn't exist right now, so that's what's keeping it at a 1-star. The only other thing worth noting with this card is that it can attach all of these various scrolls that we've seen over the past 3 sets. And essentially the one of interest, it's very unlikely that it's going to work, but it's worth noting that the one of interest is the Single Strike scroll that does 300. We're currently waiting on a ruling from Japan, but if you can attach the Single Strike scroll to Deoxys and then copy that with Mew, you can essentially do 300 for 2 energy. I don't think it's going to work. We're pretty convinced it's not going to work, in all fairness, but if you can do that, it may justify Deoxys as a one-of in the Fusion Strike deck as well, or in the Mew version of the Fusion Strike deck at least, because it could be another big blow-up option if you're able to sort of do, well, have the dream run. Obviously, it's a little bit inconsistent, and essentially it probably wouldn't be worth it anyway, but 300 for 2 is obviously absurd, and when you factor in Power Tablets and stuff as well, it means that you're pretty much always KOing a VMAX. So yeah, worth noting, we're still waiting on a ruling for that. But outside of that interaction, we don't think the Houndoom deck or the one prize Single Strike deck really has any reason to resurface, especially because the current Single Strike decks are doing so well. So that's going to kind of keep Deoxys on the down. But it is a very interesting card, and you really do have to evaluate all of those different strikes, or battle styles, I guess they're called, because it can really, you can get pretty funky with it.
Next up, we have another Fusion Strike Pokemon, this time is Stage 2. It's Dragapult. For 1 Psychic Energy, you can do Fusion Assault, which is 30 for each of the Fusion Pokemon you have in play. So maxing out at 180 damage for just 1 energy attachment. Natural free retreat on the Dragapult isn't bad either. And the hope here really is that you're going to be a predominantly one prize attacking deck with the draw engine of Genesect, more than likely here. And you're just going to be fusion systeming your way, hopefully, to your next rare candy, your next rescue carrier, your next ornery rod, those sorts of cards, making sure that you don't whiff attachments and whatnot. And really, we've been so impressed with all the other Fusion Strike builds that there's not a huge reason to want to play this. Most of the time, you're in that 2-shot range with the Fusion Assault. Even with tablets in the list, they can maybe help you reach on 1-hit KOs on 2 prize Pokemon, but never really getting anywhere into that 3 prize realm unless you've got a ton of Toxtricities in here as well, and then I don't know how you're fitting that all in and being consistent at the same time. So yeah, it's difficult to see really. Also, just in general, Stage 2 decks have so many combo pieces that it then makes Fusion System actually hard to use because you end up having, drawing into pieces that you can't play just yet and whatnot, and it gets a little bit awkward. So definitely a clunky way of playing Fusion Strike. Making the most out of Genesect is going to be done in other builds for sure.
Next up, we have Granbull. I mentioned it earlier on when discussing Maractus. Grasp Grasp is Granbull's ability that says when you play this Pokemon from your hand to evolve one of your Pokemon during a turn, you may put up to 2 tool cards from your discard pile into your hand. So essentially, it's the ball search for Galarian Mr. Rime, but it's Maractus' version. We already mentioned how Maractus isn't really going to work. We've seen that the Galarian Mr. Rime deck doesn't work. Obviously, they're both stage 1s and basics, sort of in the inverse, but regardless, it just doesn't work. We've seen that this kind of effect isn't worth it, and yeah, Maractus isn't really going to change anything about that. But again, it's a fun one to try out. It's not going to be the new Baby Blound, but at least you have sort of a way of recovering your tools to be able to ditch and shake them all over again.
Next up, we have Galarian Cursola, an interesting Psychic Stage 1. 100 hit points on it, and it has the compulsory restoration attack, putting a basic V Pokemon from your opponent's discard pile onto their bench, then put damage counters onto that Pokemon until it has 30 remaining hit points. Hopefully, trying to combine with Greedent to then take additional prizes on it. I guess that's the combo that we're sort of being sold here. But it's difficult, right? It's difficult for your opponent to already have Vs in the discard pile. So if you're trying to build a deck completely around this, you just need your opponent to randomly, for some reason, have discarded a V Pokemon at some point. If they haven't, you're doing nothing. Like, you're trying to attack with Max Greed for the first 2 turns, then you're trying to weave in a compulsory restoration, and then big stocks to win the game, I guess is the idea. So you're hoping that Max Greed just sort of gets the job done in those opening stages, which is slow and low tempo, and don't really know how you're getting the energies on if you're using Psychic Energy for the Cursola, or you're playing a mixture of attachments, that sort of thing. It seems very awkward to get rolling. And, there's ways even that your opponent can disrupt this by rodding their Pokemon back into their deck if need be or whatever, but you just need to do everything in a very, concise amount of turns, and you need to be doing exact things on exact turns, and you can get moneyed out of the game and all this other stuff. And, your Cursola could get dealt with and whatnot, and then you're really just scrambling around not knowing what to do. So, cute combo, can see what they're going for here. They're trying to push the Greedent to us, but I think Greedent will be better served just with the better cards, which is going to be Suicune and Inteleon for the most part.
Next up, we have Meloetta. Meloetta has the Melodious Echo attack that does 70 damage times the number of Fusion Strike energy attached to your Pokemon. Essentially, I think it's going to be very rare that we actually attack with the Meloetta, but we can attack with the Mew VMAX, and, well, essentially they're the same Pokemon, but Mew VMAX has way more bulk to it, so you'd rather have the Mew attacking than anything. You can get up to 280 damage with this, which is really, really nice. It means that you're not capped at that 210 from Genesect, which is cool. And essentially because of that, it may just be a one-of option that you can put into the Mew VMAX deck. And if your opponent can't deal with these fusion energy particularly quickly, and if you're able to sort of jam your way into 2 Elesa's Sparkles in the first couple of turns, or maybe find a fusion on turn 1 and 2, and then Elesa's Sparkle at some point, to be able to get to that 280. With some power tablets, you can have these really, really big turns. I think it's a fine one-of to trial. I was a lot more impressed with it before I played with it, and I'm a little bit less enthused about it now that I've sort of thought about it a bit more and tried out the deck. But I think it's a very justifiable one-of, and if your opponent, especially if your opponent isn't expecting it, they're kind of dealing with other things on the board, they're dealing with the Genesects and stuff like that, it could be a bit of a sideswipe. 280 damage for 2 is absurd, especially when you have a damage mod on top. You're already playing Fog Crystals for your Mew, so you can search it out pretty easily, and you already have Energy Acceleration. So it's a nice one-of. It's by no means as groundbreaking as me personally I thought it was in the first place, but it's definitely a potential one-of that you can just quite easily splash in. The deck wants to play lots of Fusion Pokemon anyway, so why not throw one in and try it out, and sometimes you'll be able to do 280 for 2, and maybe even KO a VMAX out of nowhere.
Onto the Dragon types, we have Goodra, an interesting Stage 2, that has the Slimy Room ability. As long as this Pokemon is in the active spot, whenever your opponent attaches an energy from their hand to their Pokemon, they must first flip a coin. If tails, that energy is discarded without being attached. Pretty rough, and you can see where the direction is going here. We're going to try and get some Goodras into the active, Try and sit there with them, end your turn Intrepid Sorting probably, and just hope that with the amount of failed flips from Slimy Room from the opponents, plus Crushing Hammers, plus Yell Grunts, constantly putting them back into their hand, maybe, just maybe, they don't get through enough Goodras and they end up decking themselves out and having no options remaining. It does have an attack Bluster Tail for Water Psychic. I think it's always too awkward to try and, have an attacking Goodra deck. I think it's probably just going to try and sit here, be annoying, force Gust from the opponent, that sort of thing for a control deck. It's just a lot of spaces, though. If you're playing rare candies and whatnot, it's just a lot to take in. Even if you're playing Zoroark and then you just add in Sliggoo and Goodra as like a 1-1 line, maybe, that you can try and go into. Still feels like a lot of work a lot of the time, where you could instead be ending your turn attacking with some of these other options that we've already mentioned. Even the options that we have right now, the Dialga and the Berserker, those sorts of things, would probably be more irritating than the Goodra would be. So flashy, annoying ability for sure. I can see it being a headache, but I don't think it's going to be all that viable.
So we have Latias. Latias is one that we've mentioned a couple of times for various reasons. First off, the Red Assist ability that says once during a turn you may use this ability, attach a Psychic Energy from your hand to one of your Latios. Joe will discuss Latios in a moment, but essentially this ability isn't all that relevant. The relevant text on the card is Dyna Barrier. It does 70 damage for 3 energy, and during your next turn, prevent all damage done to this Pokemon by attacks from your opponent's VMAX. We're never attacking with Latias, we're attacking with Mew, but that's what we've mentioned this whole time. Mew being able to copy this with Cross Fusion Strike to be able to do 70 and become immune is really nice. Against other Mews, they can just Max Miracle through you, but against all of the other VMAXs, they're going to have to find their Phoebes and stuff, which can be pretty annoying. We do think this may lead to an uptick in Phoebe seeing play naturally, which makes sense because people don't want to be caught out by Dyna Barrier. But that's kind of expected, and we feel like this is only ever going to be a 1, maybe a 2 of, but essentially a 1 of, sometimes even a 0 of. So there will be times where, again, then that Phoebe is kind of a dead card. So it's going to be one of these where, a bit like things like Decidueye and Altara and stuff, it kind of ebbs and flows with the popularity of Phoebe, but we definitely think it's worth it in the deck because it can provide some really big headaches. On top of that, in combination with Power Tablet, you're doing 100, which is really good for killing things like the Drizzles and stuff, and then being immune to their VMAXs. As Joe mentioned earlier on, we're seeing a lot of these VMAX plus Inteleon engines right now, so being able to deal with the Inteleons that maybe would be searching for the Phoebe, early, is pretty good because then it can kind of stall your opponent out here and there. So being able to do a bit of extra damage with the Power Tablet can push Dyna Barrier into some pretty nice breakpoints, and then on top of that, it can push into sort of 100 plus 210 range can be 310 with another tablet. That's 340. That's knocking out some of these VMAX Pokemon. So yeah, really, really interesting one. Only ever going to be at most a 2 of, probably a 1 of, sometimes a 0 of, but a very, very relevant 1 of, and one that will definitely change the landscape of how some of these VMAX decks have played and force them potentially to have to put in Phoebe once again.
Latios, however, is a lot less interesting. It has the blue assist, very similar to the Latias. This time you can attach a Psychic from your hand to one of your Latias in play. And then you have the Luster Purge attack for Water, Psychic, Colorless, or just 2 Colorless if you're using Mew. And you do 210 and discard 2 energy from this Pokemon. It's just worse than Technoblast, essentially, and you want Genesect on your board regardless, so you really don't need this Latios at all. Just ignore it, just ignore the abilities, and just go for Latias. If you really wanted to make a quad Latias attacking deck and just actually attack with Dyna Barrier, you may just want to add in like 1 Latios just for the blue assist option, so you can actually chain these Latias that little bit easier. But we think, the low hit points on the Latias itself, the low damage output that you have, you can end up getting bullied out just by them attacking with their Vs rather than their VMAXs. So don't think there's ever going to be a Latias quad deck. I think it only ever stars alongside Mew.
Next up we have Smeargle, another one that we've mentioned here and there. Essentially the only attack that's relevant that we're going to talk about is Trash Sketch, that says choose up to 2 Fusion Strike trainer cards from your discard pile, show them to your opponent and put them into your hand. This can get the supporters and stuff, but essentially we're looking at Cross Switcher and Power Tablet, and I guess Cross Receiver, but we've kind of said that that's not overly relevant. Cross Switcher, and in combination with Galamine, sort of exemplifies the kind of lock or control style deck that the Smeargle could open up. We don't think it's particularly strong. We've said how we think Control will be built, if it will be built at all. So I know we don't think the Smeargle is the way it's going to be built, but it's worth noting that that is a thing you can do, being able to recycle cross switches, and even like as a 4-card package of like 3 cross switches plus a Smeargle could be thrown into these control decks just as an alternative win condition potentially. Like I say, we don't think it's particularly useful, but it's there nonetheless. The place where I think it's a little bit more useful potentially is in the quad Genesect deck. Naturally, you're going to be a 2-prize attacker, so Genesect is going to be your Genesect is going to be giving up 2 prizes. So to try and skew the prize trade, we can throw a Smeargle in the active, force sort of more gusting out of our opponent, whilst also grabbing more power tablets to try and go for another of these big blowout turns in combination with Toxtricities and stuff. Can be pretty strong. Again, we're not super convinced. It hasn't played too much of a part in our Genesect build so far, but it's definitely an option, and it can force more gusting as well as being able to double down and double dip on these power tablets can be very good. It's definitely one of the key cards of the deck, so being able to do bonus damage more than once is really, really important. So definitely an option to try out. We don't think it's going to be a mainstay in the Genesect deck. A lot of the time is just trying to gun for the weak Pokemon on the bench or whatever is good enough, and you only need to sort of have this big blow-up turn once in combination with the tablets and the Toxtricities. But being able to sort of throw off the prize trade here and there is pretty cool nonetheless. So yeah, give it a try. We're not completely sold, but it has a lot of flexibility in that Trash Sketch attack, even though it essentially can only get 2 cards back.
Next up we have Dunsparce. It has the Wonder Burrow ability. Each player's colorless Pokemon in play has no weakness. And on a basic, this is really, really good, actually. We're only giving it the 1-star right now because we don't think there's a home for the deck. We've seen Quad Blissey before, and its fighting weakness is one of the reasons why it's not doing so well right now. And maybe, who knows, there could come back a Path deck that plays just one Dunsparce in here to protect you that little bit. But there's nothing to say that the opponent can't just deal with the Dunsparce and carry on with the day, and you don't want to ever put a second one into play because then the prize map gets easy for the opponent. Togekiss is a decent deck, and we're not super afraid of Lightning anyway, because again, Jolteon's like the main deck in the game, and they're limited to 200 damage anyway, so you wouldn't even need Dunsparce in that regard. And Greedent is going to be a bit part player rather than a 4-3 line and lean fully into it, so no home for Dunsparce right now. But we have to respect every future colorless Pokemon coming out. Spoilers, we've seen V-Star, and the first one that we've seen is weak to fighting, so certainly a keep card, and we think it will find a home eventually. And we always have to earmark every colorless Pokemon now as potentially not having to worry about weakness, which is obviously very good for you. There's just not many homes at the moment, but certainly a great ability for any colorless deck coming out.
That is it. That's our 1-prizer summary. Make sure you pick up some of these 4-star cards. There's nothing quite 5-star, but in general, compared to some of the 1-prizes we've had in the past few sets, this is actually not a bad one. We've got Oricorio and Latias and Toxtricity, which all look to be great in the fusion decks. We've got Azumaril, which looks to be pretty cool. And we've also got Gorbyss and Huntail, as well as Smeargle, that all look to be pretty interesting control options as well. So yeah, that's the set review. Really, really exciting stuff. I think this is another hugely impactful set. Genesect, as I mentioned, I think completely warps the meta. But there's also, outside of Genesect, some other really, really interesting options. We've been playing on tabletop every day this week, and I think we can both say we've really been enjoying how the new format feels. It's nice to be moving away from purely Inteleon engines and bringing a whole new engine to the game, especially given that it's a Peony engine as well, which is just completely different. So yeah, really, really fun. I'm sure there's various cards that we maybe didn't pick up on or talk about, or maybe that you just have some different opinions on. So let us know it all down below. We're always really interested to hear what you think of cards we missed, cards we didn't talk about, cards we maybe overlooked something, or cards maybe that we enlightened you about something and gave you an idea of or 2 of what you want to build when the set comes out. We're only 2 weeks or 2 or 3 weeks away as well, which is crazy. It feels like these sets are just being churned out right now. But I'm really, really excited, especially as it might go hand in hand with the release of TCG Live as well, which is obviously on, in everyone's thoughts right now. So yeah, very, very exciting stuff. Unless there's anything else from you, Joe?
Yeah, keep an eye out for the streams. We're going to be playing more Fusion Strike stuff on tabletop until it comes out on either PTCGO or live, whichever one comes first. And then, yeah, keep an eye out for the tier list, the buy list, and all the other Fusion Strike content that's on the way. Thanks so much for watching if you made it this far, and we'll see you in another video soon. Cheers.